It began with shadows moving across the snow. Not clean shadows, not the kind cast by trees or moonlight, but the kind left behind by engines smoking in the winter air, by boots pounding through frozen mud, by men who carried with them a silence too sharp to be natural. In the early days of the Ardennes offensive, when the forest groaned under artillery and villages vanished beneath the fog of war, one formation pushed forward faster, harder, and darker than the rest. Kampfgruppe Peiper, a spearhead made of steel, fuel, and fanatic resolve, driving toward a breakthrough that the German High Command believed could change the whole shape of the war. It wasn't a formation built for defense. It wasn't built for mercy. It was built for speed, shock, and fear. The men inside the vehicles felt the cold in their bones. Exhaust pipes glowed red against the icy air. Panthers and half-tracks crawled forward through narrow roads bordered by skeletal trees. Snowflakes drifted onto metal, still warm from the last engagement. The world around them was quiet, except for the grinding of treads and the occasional echo of a commander's voice carried by the winter wind. But the quiet was a lie. The Ardennes was never silent for long. Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed through villages where civilians clung to hope and fear in equal measure. They advanced along roads so narrow that even the forest seemed to lean inward, as if watching what passed beneath its branches. The formation moved with a disturbing combination of discipline and unpredictability. One moment a fast armoured thrust, the next a sudden storm of violence sparked by tension, rumour, or command. As they pushed deeper, the roads clogged. Fuel trucks lagged behind. Maps became unreliable. American units appeared where they weren't expected. And the Ardennes winter pressed against every decision. Then came the actions that would stain the name of Kampfgruppe Peiper forever. Actions not born from desperation, but from a brutal ideology that blurred the line between military force and murder. Actions that left civilians dead in snow-covered fields. Actions that turned prisoners of war into victims of cold metal and colder choices. The deeper the formation moved into Belgium, the more its mission twisted into something chaotic, violent, and doomed. They fought through towns lit by burning barns. They marched past bodies half buried in drifts of snow. They stormed crossroads where American soldiers fought with the desperation of men who understood what was advancing toward them. But winter, terrain, resistance, and overconfidence built a cage around the attackers. Fuel ran out, vehicles froze, roads vanished beneath ice, and the forest that had watched them enter began to close behind them like a trap snapping shut. Kampfgruppe Peiper did not retreat. It collapsed inward, piece by piece, vehicle by vehicle, decision by decision, until the formation became a fragment of what it once was. Tonight, we return to that cold, brutal march, to the sound of engines struggling in the winter air, to the fear that spread ahead of them and the consequences that follow behind, to a story that reminds us that not all units in war are remembered for bravery. Some are remembered because their path forces us to confront the darkest corners of human choice. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something quiet and personal, not about the war, but about you. As you listen tonight, what kind of stillness surrounds you? Is it calm, heavy, thoughtful? Describe the feeling in your own words. And something deeper, unique to this episode. History includes moments we wish had never happened. In your own life, is there a moment you learned something about human nature that changed the way you see the world? If you feel comfortable, share the lesson, not the pain, just the insight it left behind. And if these long, reflective journeys into the past help you unwind, slow your thoughts, or drift gently towards sleep, consider subscribing. June 1934, Berlin. A 19-year-old man with sharp features and aristocratic bearing stands in a formation of young recruits, their black uniforms crisp in the summer heat. Joachim Peiper raises his right hand, swearing allegiance not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler personally. The ceremony marks his entry into the SS Verfügungstruppe, the armed wing of an organization that would become synonymous with terror. At this moment, Peiper is simply an ambitious young officer candidate from a respectable Berlin family. Within a decade, he would command one of the most feared armoured formations on the Western Front. The path from that sunny parade ground to the frozen forests of the Ardennes began with privilege and ideology in equal measure. Joachim Peiper was born on January 30th, 1915, into an upper-middle-class family in the Wilmersdorf district of Berlin. His father served as an officer in the Imperial German Army during the First World War, instilling in young Joachim a military bearing and sense of Prussian discipline from childhood. The family was not wealthy, but they were educated, cultured, and deeply affected by Germany's defeat in 1918. Young Peiper grew up in the chaos of the Weimar Republic, watching his country torn between communist uprisings and right-wing paramilitaries, hyperinflation destroying the savings of the middle class, and national humiliation embedded in the Treaty of Versailles. For Germans of Peiper's generation, these were not abstract political problems, but lived experiences that shaped their worldview. The promise of national restoration that Hitler offered resonated powerfully. Peiper's selection for SS officer training reflected both the regime's racial ideology and his own ambition. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, was constructing itself as a racial elite, accepting only candidates who could prove pure Aryan ancestry back multiple generations. Peiper easily met these criteria, but beyond racial credentials, the SS sought a particular psychological profile: intelligent, physically capable, ideologically committed, and capable of ruthlessness in service of the movement. During his training at the SS Junkerschule at Bad Tölz in Bavaria, Peiper excelled. The curriculum combined conventional military instruction with intensive Nazi ideological indoctrination. Instructors emphasized that the SS man was engaged in an existential racial struggle, that conventional morality did not apply when fighting enemies of the Volk, that absolute obedience to superiors was the highest virtue. These were not abstract lessons. They were preparing young officers for the wars of annihilation that Hitler already planned. By 1938, Peiper's combination of military competence and ideological reliability brought him to the attention of the highest levels of the regime. At age 23, he was appointed as one of Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutants, serving directly under the Reichsführer SS. This was an extraordinary position for such a young officer. For 3 years, Peiper accompanied Himmler on inspection tours across Germany, and after 1939, the occupied territories, he witnessed the machinery of SS power firsthand: concentration camps, deportations, and the administrative apparatus of state terror. In October 1941, Peiper accompanied Himmler to Ukraine, where he observed mass executions of Jews and Soviet prisoners carried out by Einsatzgruppen units behind the advancing German army. These were not combat operations. They were systematic murders of unarmed civilians, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency by men following orders. Peiper's later defenders would claim he was merely a soldier following military orders. But his service as Himmler's adjutant placed him at the very center of SS criminality during the period when the apparatus of genocide was being constructed. In 1941, Peiper requested transfer to a combat unit. Whether this reflected a desire to escape the administrative horrors he witnessed, or simply the ambition of a young officer seeking military glory, remains unknowable. He was assigned to the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, that had been expanded into a full armoured division. The LSSAH was the most prestigious formation in the Waffen-SS, receiving the best equipment, the most intensive training, and carrying out the most demanding operations. It was also becoming notorious for war crimes. During the invasion of France in 1940, LSSAH troops murdered British prisoners at Wormhout. During the invasion of Greece in 1941, they burned villages and executed civilians in reprisal operations. The unit's culture combined military excellence with ideological fanaticism and casual brutality toward those deemed enemies of the Reich. On the Eastern Front, Peiper found his calling as a panzer commander. The war against the Soviet Union was conceived by Nazi leadership as a war of annihilation, explicitly exempt from the laws of war. Wehrmacht and SS units operated under the infamous Kommissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political officers, and the Barbarossa Decree, which exempted German soldiers from prosecution for crimes against Soviet civilians. In this environment, the LSSAH operated with extraordinary aggression. Peiper commanded tank companies and then battalions in the brutal fighting around Kharkov in January 1943. The Soviet city changed hands multiple times in savage house-to-house combat. Peiper's unit fought with skill and ferocity, destroying Soviet defensive positions with combined infantry and armor tactics. But they also participated in reprisal operations against civilians, burning villages suspected of harboring partisans and executing prisoners. These actions were documented in Soviet investigations and later partially confirmed by German records. Peiper's reputation as a combat commander grew alongside the casualty lists. The fighting on the Eastern Front was unlike anything in the West. Soviet forces fought with desperation, born of knowledge that surrender often meant death. German armoured units conducted deep penetrations into enemy lines, becoming surrounded, fighting their way out, then attacking again. The Leibstandarte suffered 70% casualties by late 1943, with entire battalions destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. In this cauldron, Peiper became known for his tactical aggression and personal courage. During the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, he commanded a tank battalion that destroyed over 30 Soviet tanks in a single engagement, personally leading the attack from the front. He received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest decoration for valour. His men called him Blowtorch for his aggressive tactics and willingness to burn through obstacles. Whether that nickname also referred to his unit's practice of burning villages is a question that would haunt him later. By November 1944, Joachim Peiper, now 29 years old, commanded SS Panzer Regiment 1 of the Leibstandarte. He was a highly decorated officer with a combat record that combined extraordinary tactical success with documented participation in war crimes. This combination was not unusual in the Waffen-SS. It was almost the defining characteristic. The same units that fought with skill and bravery also murdered prisoners and civilians with bureaucratic regularity. The same officers who displayed tactical brilliance also commanded units that committed atrocities. Peiper embodied this duality. He was known for personally brave acts, leading from the front, sharing dangers with his men, showing tactical innovation in combined arms operations. He was also an SS officer who had witnessed mass murder as Himmler's adjutant, commanded a unit implicated in multiple war crimes on the Eastern Front, and internalized an ideology that classified entire populations as subhuman enemies deserving of annihilation. When Peiper received orders in early December 1944 to prepare his regiment for a major offensive in the West, he had already proven himself in the most brutal fighting of the war. His Kampfgruppe would be designated the spearhead of 6th SS Panzer Army's main attack. He was chosen specifically because of his reputation for aggressive leadership and his willingness to accept high casualties in pursuit of objectives. But the young officer who had joined the SS in 1934 had been transformed by a decade of war and ideology. The aristocratic Berlin youth had become a hardened combat commander who had seen and done things that would define the remainder of his life. The question that would follow him until his death was whether the tactical brilliance and personal courage could ever be separated from command responsibility for atrocities. The answer to that question would be written in the snow-covered forests and villages of Belgium in the brutal winter ahead. The making of Joachim Peiper was complete. An intelligent, capable officer, moulded by Nazi ideology, hardened by Eastern Front combat, and selected to lead one of the most critical operations of the war. His story is inseparable from the story of the SS itself. An organization that combined military effectiveness with systematic criminality, personal bravery with collective atrocity, tactical innovation with moral catastrophe. Understanding Peiper requires holding these contradictions in view simultaneously, resisting the temptation to simplify him into either pure villain or misunderstood soldier. He was a product of his time, his ideology, and his choices. And in December 1944, those forces would converge on a single road through the Belgian Ardennes, with consequences that would reverberate for decades. September 16th, 1944, the Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler sits in his concrete bunker, his left hand trembling from the effects of the July 20th assassination attempt. Just 8 weeks earlier, a bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg had nearly killed him. The blast left Hitler partially deaf, his right arm temporarily paralyzed, and his already paranoid worldview now completely dominated by suspicion of his own military officers. As he studies maps of the Western Front, his finger traces a line through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. Here, he believes, Germany can still change the course of the war. Here, a single decisive blow can fracture the Allied coalition and buy time for miracle weapons to turn the tide. It is the thinking of a desperate man who has lost touch with reality, but it is also the thinking of the dictator who still commands millions of soldiers and the industrial capacity of occupied Europe. The strategic situation that autumn was catastrophic from any rational perspective. In the east, the Soviet summer offensive Operation Bagration had destroyed Army Group Center, killing or capturing nearly 400,000 German soldiers. Soviet forces now stood on the borders of East Prussia, poised to invade Germany itself. In the west, the Allies had liberated France with stunning speed after the Normandy breakout. By September, American and British forces were closing on the German border. The Wehrmacht had lost over 1 million men in the summer campaigns. Equipment losses were equally staggering. Over 2,000 tanks, thousands of aircraft, and irreplaceable reserves of fuel and ammunition. Germany's situation was objectively hopeless. Every military professional understood that defeat was now a question of when, not if. But Hitler's strategic calculus was not based on conventional military logic. It was based on will, on the Nazi ideological conviction that fanatical determination could overcome material disadvantage, and on a desperate hope that the Anglo-American alliance could be broken. The plan Hitler presented to his generals on October 11th was breathtaking in its ambition and divorced from reality in equal measure. Codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, to suggest a defensive operation, it called for massing 25 divisions, nearly 250,000 men, in the Eifel region opposite the weakly held American sector in the Ardennes. 3 armies would attack on a 60-mile front, smash through the American positions, cross the Meuse River, and drive 200 kilometres to capture the port of Antwerp. The operation would split the Allied armies, trap British and Canadian forces north of the breakthrough, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. With the Western Front stabilised, Germany could then transfer forces east to hold the Soviets. Hitler presented this plan with complete conviction. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model, the 2 senior commanders in the West, listened with growing disbelief. When Hitler finished, Rundstedt called the plan absolutely impossible. Model termed it a Christmas-time fairy tale. Neither objection mattered. The intelligence picture that gave Hitler confidence was fatally flawed. Fremde Heere West, the German military intelligence unit responsible for analysing Allied forces, reported on November 3rd that the Ardennes sector was unusually weak. This assessment was correct. The American 8 Corps held an 85-mile front with only 4 divisions, far below the standard defensive density. The sector had been designated a quiet area where green divisions could gain experience and battered units could rest and refit. Allied intelligence had concluded that Germany lacked the resources for a major offensive, an assessment, ironically, based on accurate information about Germany's fuel crisis. But German intelligence failed to detect the massive Allied reserves positioned behind the front or the ability of American logistics to rapidly shift forces. More critically, German planners underestimated American resilience and adaptability. The plan assumed American units would collapse when hit by overwhelming force, as French units had in 1940. This assumption would prove disastrously wrong. The offensive required 3 conditions that were individually difficult and collectively almost impossible to achieve. First, complete surprise. The concentration of 25 divisions, 1,400 tanks, and thousands of support vehicles had to be accomplished without Allied reconnaissance detecting it. Second, perfect weather. Low clouds and fog were essential to neutralize Allied air superiority. German forces had no chance of success under clear skies that would allow Allied fighter bombers to massacre their columns. Third, capturing fuel depots intact. German tanks had enough fuel for only 100 kilometres, perhaps a third of the distance to Antwerp. The plan required German spearheads to capture American fuel dumps before they could be destroyed. This was not a military plan. It was a desperate gamble on a 3-way parlay where every bet had to pay off perfectly. On November 25th, the final war game was conducted at the Adlerhorst, Hitler's command post near Frankfurt. Staff officers presented the logistics in brutal detail. The attacking forces would need 55,000 tons of supplies in the first week alone, but the destroyed French railway system could deliver only 15,000 tons. Fuel was the critical constraint. Panzer divisions would carry enough fuel to advance 100 kilometres, then would have to stop unless they captured American supplies. The Meuse River crossings were 200 kilometres from the start line. When officers pointed out these mathematical impossibilities, Hitler's response was telling: the army will capture enemy fuel depots in the first days. An entire strategic offensive was predicated on capturing supplies from an enemy the planners simultaneously assumed would collapse, but somehow maintain intact. Supply dumps. The contradictions were evident to everyone except the Supreme Commander. The attack was structured around 3 armies with distinct missions. In the north, Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, the strongest force with 4 SS Panzer divisions, would make the main effort. Their axis of advance ran through Malmedy and Liège to the Meuse crossings at Huy. This northern route was most direct, but also the most challenging terrain. Narrow roads through forests, steep valleys, and numerous rivers. In the center, Hasso von Mantefel's 5th Panzer Army would strike toward Bastogne and the Meuse at Dinant. The southern axis was more open terrain, but also more heavily defended. Finally, Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would provide flank protection against American forces attacking from the south. This was a secondary mission with limited armor support. The plan's success depended entirely on the 6th SS Panzer Army achieving rapid breakthrough and exploitation, and the spearhead of that breakthrough would be Kampfgruppe Peiper. On December 10th, Joachim Peiper received his final orders at 6th Panzer Army headquarters. The briefing was conducted in a farmhouse near Münstereifel under conditions of absolute secrecy. Peiper was told his Kampfgruppe would be the Spitze, the spearhead, of the entire offensive. His mission was brutally simple: break through American lines, drive to the Meuse River without regard to flanks or losses, and seize bridges before they could be destroyed. Speed was everything. Peiper was told explicitly not to stop to engage American strongpoints, but to bypass them, leaving follow-on forces to reduce isolated positions. His route, designated Rollbahn D, would take him through Losheim, Stavelot, Trois-Ponts, and Webermont to High on the Meuse. The distance was 145 kilometers. The timeline was incredibly aggressive. Reach the Meuse within 48 hours of the opening attack. Peiper studied the maps, noting the narrow roads and critical bridges. He asked about fuel supplies. The answer was vague. German fuel trucks would follow, but Peiper should capture American depots whenever possible. It was an honest answer. The entire operation depended on theft. The forces assembled for the offensive represented Germany's last strategic reserve. Over 1,400 tanks and assault guns were massed in the attack sectors, including substantial numbers of Panthers, the best medium tank in the German arsenal, and King Tigers, the most powerful tank of the war, but mechanically unreliable and fuel-hungry. Infantry divisions were brought up to strength, with soldiers scraped from other fronts, training units, and even the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. Artillery parks were assembled with ammunition stockpiles that took months to accumulate. Everything was committed to this single roll of the dice. If the offensive failed, Germany would have no reserves left to defend the Rhine or the eastern borders. But Hitler's calculation was that Germany had no choice. Doing nothing guaranteed slow strangulation as Allied forces closed from east and west. Only a dramatic reversal of fortunes could change the trajectory of the war. It was the logic of desperation masquerading as strategy. The generals who would execute the offensive had deep reservations they dared not voice except in private conversations. Model told his staff the plan was insane, but added that orders must be followed. Rundstedt never believed in the operation, but was too old and too compromised to resist. Only Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, managed to convince Hitler to modify some tactical details, such as starting the attack without a preliminary bombardment to preserve surprise. But the fundamental problems remained unaddressed: insufficient fuel, inadequate logistics, unrealistic timelines, and gross underestimation of American capabilities. The operation was conceived in desperation, planned in defiance of logistics, and executed with the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that had become characteristic of Nazi strategic thinking. Every decision Hitler made in the final years of the war followed the same pattern: escalate the stakes, commit everything to a single throw, and hope for a miracle. The Ardennes offensive was the clearest example of this pathology. As December progressed and troops moved into assembly areas under cover of darkness, soldiers began to sense something significant was coming. Equipment losses from the summer campaigns had been made good. Units that had been bled white in France were back at strength. Tiger tanks that hadn't been seen in months appeared on rail cars. Fuel trucks, a rare sight in recent weeks, arrived in convoys. Rations improved. The signs of a major operation were unmistakable to experienced soldiers. But even they could not imagine the scale of what was planned. Hitler had demanded absolute secrecy. Radio traffic was prohibited. Orders were delivered by courier. Unit designations were camouflaged. Allied intelligence detected some activity but interpreted it as defensive preparations or perhaps a limited counterattack. The biggest strategic surprise on the Western Front since D-Day was about to be unleashed. And at the tip of the spear, Joachim Peiper prepared his Kampfgruppe to drive through the American lines to a destination 145 kilometers away. Through terrain he had never seen, on roads barely adequate for civilian traffic, with fuel for only a third of the journey. It was a mission that combined tactical sophistication with strategic madness. Within days, the world would discover whether desperation or determination would prevail in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. December 8th, 1944. A cramped farmhouse near the German border. Joachim Peiper hunches over topographical maps, spread across a rough wooden table, the winter afternoon light barely sufficient for detailed work. Around him, staff officers from SS Panzer Regiment 1 trace routes with pencils, calculate vehicle spacing, and argue about bridge capacities in hushed voices. The map shows Rollbahn D, the route Peiper's Kampfgruppe will follow to the Noose River. On paper, it is a thin red line running 145 kilometres through the Belgian Ardennes. On the ground, it is a nightmare of medieval village streets, wooden bridges rated for farm carts, and steep forest trails never designed for 70-ton king tigers. Peiper's finger follows the route, stopping at each bridge marked on the map. His engineering officer has already delivered the bad news. Most of these bridges cannot support Germany's heaviest tanks. The entire operation depends on finding alternate routes or capturing bridges before Americans can destroy them. It is another layer of impossible requirements stacked upon an already precarious plan. The selection of Rollbahn D reflected desperate compromise between speed and terrain. 6 potential routes had been identified through the Ardennes, designated Rollbahn in A through F. Rollbahn D was chosen for Kampfgruppe Peiper because it was the most direct path to the Meuse crossing at Huy, cutting through the American lines at their weakest point near Losheim. But directness came at a severe cost. The route began with 15 kilometres of single-lane forest trails, unpaved and barely maintained. It then traversed a series of small villages with streets built in medieval times, when the largest vehicle was an ox cart. The roads wound through steep valleys, crossed multiple rivers, and climbed grades that would challenge even tracked vehicles. American engineers who had improved these roads during the summer advance had done so only to support supply trucks, not armoured columns. The bridges were a particular concern. Belgian records showed most were stone or timber construction from the 19th century, rated for 15 to 20 tons. A Panther tank weighed 45 tons. A King Tiger weighed 68 tons. On December 12th, reconnaissance teams conducted secret nighttime surveys of critical bridges. Wearing American uniforms and driving captured jeeps, German soldiers photographed the bridges at Losheim, Stavelot, and Trois-Ponts. What they found confirmed the worst fears. The bridge at Losheim was timber construction, clearly inadequate for heavy tanks. The bridge at Stavelot was stone masonry, possibly strong enough for Panthers but questionable for King Tigers. The bridge at Trois-Ponts was reinforced concrete, the strongest on the route, rated for approximately 50 tons but never tested with military vehicles. Back at headquarters, Engineering Officer Werner Sternebeck presented his calculations with Germanic precision. King Tigers would require stone or concrete bridges. If those bridges were destroyed or collapsed, the entire column would halt. Infantry would have to be deployed ahead of the tanks to secure every bridge before the column arrived. It was another tactical requirement that assumed everything would go perfectly in the chaos of combat. The composition of Kampfgruppe Peiper reflected the compromises inherent in the operation. The force consisted of approximately 4,800 men and over 600 vehicles, organised into a combined arms formation designed for rapid exploitation. The corps was SS Panzer Regiment 1 with 72 tanks, a company of King Tigers, companies of Panthers, and companies of Panzer IVs. Supporting these were 2 battalions of mechanized infantry in half-tracks, a battalion of self-propelled artillery, engineers, reconnaissance troops, and anti-aircraft units. This was a formidable force on paper, equivalent to a small armoured division, but organising it for movement revealed the fundamental problem. A column of 600 vehicles stretched 25 kilometres along a single road. If the lead elements were attacked, rear elements couldn't manoeuvre to support them. If rear elements were cut off, forward elements would be isolated. The column had to keep moving or it would become an immobile target. Peiper personally walked sections of the route near the German border on December 14th, accompanied only by his adjutant. They drove to within sight of American positions, studying the terrain with binoculars. The forests were dense, the valleys steep and narrow. In several villages, Peiper measured street widths by pacing, 12 feet, 15 feet, barely wide enough for a tank to pass without scraping buildings on both sides. In one village, A stone fountain stood in the center of the main square, creating a choke point where vehicles would have to slow to walking speed to maneuver around it. These details were not on the planning maps, they were the reality of trying to move a modern mechanized force through landscape that had changed little since the Middle Ages. Peiper returned to headquarters deeply concerned but unwilling to voice his doubts to superiors. In the SS, expressing skepticism about orders was dangerous. Men had been shot for defeatism over lesser concerns. The final briefing on December 15th revealed the contingency planning, or rather the lack of it. If the primary bridges at Stavelot or Trois-Ponts were destroyed, Kampfgruppe Peiper was to divert north toward Rollbahn or south toward Honsfeld, seeking alternate crossings, but both diversions would add 30 kilometers and consume fuel the force could not spare. If both primary and alternate routes were blocked, the Kampfgruppe was to exploit any opportunity and use initiative to reach the Noose. These were not orders, they were admissions that planning had reached the limits of what was knowable. Everything beyond the first day of combat was improvisation. Peiper asked about engineer support for bridge construction. He was told engineers would follow the lead elements, but could not be everywhere simultaneously. The subtext was clear: capture bridges intact, or accept that the operation would fail. The road conditions would be heavily influenced by weather, another uncontrollable variable. German meteorologists predicted freezing temperatures and low clouds for mid-December, ideal conditions for the offensive. Frozen ground would support the weight of heavy tanks, even off-road, but if temperatures rose and rain fell, the unpaved sections of Rollbahn D would become impassable bogs. Mud was the great enemy of mechanized warfare, more effective than minefields at stopping advances. The offensive was scheduled for December 16th, timed to exploit predicted weather. But weather predictions were notoriously unreliable, and the entire operation depended on meteorological accuracy. It was one more element of the plan that required perfect conditions. The tactical doctrine for the advance was based on German experience from 1940 in the Eastern Front: move fast, bypass resistance, maintain momentum. Peiper was explicitly ordered not to stop to reduce American strongpoints. If a village was defended, go around it. If a roadblock was encountered, blast through it or find another route. The psychological impact of German tanks appearing in rear areas would cause collapse more effectively than direct combat. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in France in 1940 when German panzers drove to the English Channel in 10 days. It had worked on the Eastern Front when German armour carved through Soviet defences in vast encirclements. But it required specific conditions: inferior enemy morale, poor communications, and most critically, adequate fuel. None of these conditions were guaranteed in Belgium in December 1944. American units were well supplied, had excellent radio communications, and knew their defensive sectors intimately. The doctrine of rapid exploitation was sound, but the conditions for its success were increasingly questionable. The maps and plans Peiper studied in that cold farmhouse represented thousands of hours of staff work. German military planning was legendarily thorough, with officers trained to consider every variable and prepare for contingencies. But all that planning ran into the hard wall of reality, an operation that required capturing intact bridges along a single road through difficult terrain with barely adequate fuel and no room for error. The word Rollbahn itself was telling. It was railway terminology adapted for mechanized columns during the Blitzkrieg years. A Rollbahn was supposed to function like a railway. Vehicles entered at one end, travelled at constant speed, and arrived at their destination on schedule. But Rollbahn D was not a railway. It was a collection of dirt tracks, narrow village streets, and obsolete bridges through some of the most challenging terrain on the Western Front. The gap between the theoretical plan and practical reality was immense. As darkness fell on December 15th, Peiper returned to his command post and gathered his battalion commanders for a final briefing. He spread the maps and walked them through the route one more time. Losheim, Lanzerath, Honsfeld, Büllingen, Stavelot, Trois-Ponts, Rollbahn, Hoy. The names meant nothing yet, just Belgian villages marked on maps. Within days, they would be seared into memory and history. Peiper's final instruction was simple and chilling: we will not stop. No matter what happens, we drive for the Noose. His officers nodded. They were SS men, trained to follow orders without question, confident in their equipment and their ideology. If the route was difficult, they would overcome it. If bridges were threatened, they would capture them. If Americans resisted, they would crush them. The plan's logical inconsistencies and impossible requirements were not their concern. Their concern was execution. At 05:30 the next morning, the largest German offensive in the West since 1940 would begin. And Rollbahn D, the theoretical line on a map, would become a killing ground where the ambitions of Nazi Germany's last offensive would run into the reality of American resistance, inadequate fuel, and medieval infrastructure. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic tactical operations of the Second World War, an operation designed without regard for practical constraints and destined to fail for exactly that reason. December 10th, 1944. A foxhole on the Belgian-German border. Colonel Hurley Fuller, commander of the 110th Infantry Regiment, writes in his diary, by the dim light of a hooded flashlight. The entry records considerable enemy activity opposite our positions and adds a prescient note. Something is brewing. Fuller commands one of 4 American regiments holding an 85-mile front in the Ardennes, a sector that army planners have designated as quiet, suitable for green divisions to gain experience and battered units to rest. But Fuller is a veteran officer who has spent weeks observing the German lines through binoculars and listening to reports from his frontline observation posts. What he sees concerns him deeply. The forests opposite his positions show unusual movement. His patrols report sounds of tracked vehicles at night. German artillery that had been quiet for months is registering targets. Something is building in those dark forests, but when Fuller sends his concerns up the chain of command, they are dismissed as nervousness or routine defensive preparations. The American deployment in the Ardennes in December 1944 reflected strategic calculations that were logical but tragically wrong. After the breakout from Normandy and the rapid advance across France, Allied commanders faced decisions about where to concentrate forces for the final push into Germany. The northern approach through the Low Countries toward the Ruhr industrial region was the main effort. The southern approach through Lorraine toward the Saar was the secondary effort. The Ardennes in between was considered unsuitable for major operations. The dense forests, poor roads, and difficult terrain had led military planners since the 19th century to consider the region nearly impassable for large forces. This assessment had proven wrong in 1940 when German armour drove through the Ardennes to outflank the Maginot Line. But by December 1944, Allied intelligence concluded that Germany lacked the resources for offensive operations. The Ardennes was designated a quiet sector where units could recuperate between more demanding assignments. The forces holding this quiet sector were dangerously inadequate for the frontage involved. The 8th Corps under Major General Troy Middleton stretched 4 divisions across 85 miles, a ratio of more than 20 miles per division. Standard defensive doctrine called for 1 division per 5 miles at most. The 99th Infantry Division, positioned near Losheim where Kampfgruppe Peiper would attack, had been in combat for only 2 weeks. They were trained and motivated but inexperienced in the brutal reality of winter warfare. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived in the sector only on December 11th, just 5 days before the offensive. Some battalions were still familiarising themselves with their positions when the German attack began. The 14th Cavalry Group, a reconnaissance formation never intended for static defence, covered an 18-mile front with light vehicles and dismounted troopers. These were good soldiers commanded by competent officers, but they were spread impossibly thin and lacked the heavy weapons and fortifications needed to stop a determined attack. On December 12th, an event occurred that should have triggered alarm bells at every level of Allied command. A German sergeant from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division defected near Monschau, crossing into American lines and requesting to speak with intelligence officers. Under interrogation, he provided detailed information. A major offensive was planned for December 15th or 16th, involving at least 20 divisions. He described the assembly of armour, the stockpiling of ammunition, and the intense secrecy surrounding the operation. His testimony was specific, credible, and accurate. The interrogating officers forwarded his report through channels with the assessment that this was valuable intelligence requiring immediate attention. At 8th Corps headquarters, the report was read and dismissed. The German was classified as a plant, his testimony evaluated as enemy propaganda designed to cause Allied forces to waste resources responding to a fictional threat. The report never reached higher headquarters with appropriate urgency. A single junior German soldier had provided precise warning of the largest German offensive on the Western Front, and that warning was disregarded as deception. The intelligence failure that allowed the Ardennes offensive to achieve complete surprise was not the result of missing information, but of systematic misinterpretation of available data. 18 separate indicators of German offensive preparations were detected by Allied intelligence between late November and December 15th. Radio traffic analysis showed increased activity in the Eifel region. Aerial reconnaissance noted the appearance of new vehicle parks and supply dumps. Frontline observation posts reported sounds of armour and the movement of troops at night. Local civilians reported seeing German soldiers and equipment concentrating in the border forests. POW interrogations produced multiple references to an impending attack, but each piece of evidence was evaluated in isolation and explained away. Radio traffic was interpreted as administrative activity. Supply dumps were assessed as stockpiles for defensive operations. Reports of tanks were dismissed as a few vehicles moving to new positions. The systematic error was confirmation bias. Allied intelligence had concluded that Germany lacked offensive capability, so evidence of offensive preparations was reinterpreted to fit that conclusion. Ultra intercepts, the decoded German radio messages that had provided such valuable intelligence throughout the war, contributed to the misassessment. Messages decoded in November showed German forces struggling with severe fuel shortages, with units reporting they lacked fuel for training exercises. Allied analysts correctly concluded that Germany's fuel situation was desperate. They then made the logical but incorrect inference that an army without fuel for training could not mount a major offensive. What analysts missed was that Hitler had ordered absolute radio silence for Wacht am Rhein. The offensive forces were not using radio communications that could be intercepted. The fuel shortage messages Ultra detected were real, but they came from units not involved in the offensive. The intelligence picture was accurate but incomplete, showing Germany's general weakness while missing the specific concentration of forces for the Ardennes attack. It was a failure of synthesis. Individual pieces of intelligence were correctly interpreted, but the overall pattern was missed. At the highest levels of Allied command, the assessment was unanimous and confident. Germany could not attack. On December 12th, General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, told his staff that the enemy is incapable of launching a major offensive operation. This was not a casual opinion. It was a formal intelligence estimate distributed to subordinate commands. General Dwight Eisenhower was in Paris, focused on supply problems and plans for operations after the first of the year. General George Patton was planning an offensive toward the Saarbrücken area, scheduled to begin in late December. The entire command structure was oriented toward attack, not defense. Resources were positioned for offensive operations in the north and south. Reserves were minimal. The possibility of a major German counteroffensive was considered so remote that it did not feature in planning. This was not incompetence, it was a reasonable assessment based on Germany's strategic situation. But reasonable assessments that are wrong create catastrophes. On December 14th, the 99th Infantry Division conducted a practice alert exercise, a routine training event designed to test the unit's readiness to respond to emergencies. Soldiers were roused from their positions, assembled, and given mock orders to respond to a simulated German attack. It was professional training, the kind of exercise that kept units sharp. The bitter irony was that they were practicing for an attack that would begin in reality less than 36 hours later. The positions they rehearsed defending were the exact positions where Volksgrenadier divisions would assault. The responses they practiced were the responses they would execute under actual fire. But neither the officers conducting the exercise nor the soldiers participating in it had any idea that the simulation was about to become devastatingly real. They had been told repeatedly that this was a quiet sector. On the evening of December 15th, 40 miles behind the front lines in Luxembourg City, officers from the 8th Corps headquarters gathered at a cafe to celebrate. It was an informal gathering, men taking a brief respite from the grinding routine of staff work. They discussed the latest news, shared letters from home, and speculated about when the war might end. The consensus was that Germany was finished, that the war would be over by spring at the latest, that the greatest danger facing them was boredom in this quiet sector. Outside the cafe, snow began to fall, light flurries that would accumulate through the night. The temperature dropped steadily. By midnight, the Ardennes was frozen and still, forests dark under low clouds, villages quiet, American soldiers on watch peering into the darkness and seeing nothing unusual. In the forests on the German side of the border, 250,000 men waited in absolute silence for the order to attack. They had been told to maintain radio discipline, to make no unnecessary noise, to prepare for the assault that would begin before dawn. The quiet sector was about to become the loudest place on Earth. Every assessment, every intelligence estimate, every confident prediction of German weakness was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The soldiers in their foxholes, the officers in their headquarters, the commanders planning offensives, none of them knew that the war they thought was nearly won was about to become desperate again. In less than 12 hours, the largest German offensive on the Western Front would erupt across the forest, and the American soldiers who had been told they were in a safe area to rest and refit would find themselves fighting for survival against an onslaught they had been assured was impossible. The failure to see what was coming was not the result of negligence but of certainty, the dangerous kind of certainty that comes from logical analysis of incomplete information. It was a failure that would cost thousands of lives and transform a quiet sector into one of the most famous battlefields of the Second World War. The stage was set, the actors in position, and the curtain about to rise on a drama that neither side fully anticipated but both would remember forever. December 16th, 1944, 5:29 a.m. The Ardennes forest is absolutely silent under low clouds. Snow lying in patches on frozen ground. In American foxholes stretching along 85 miles of front, soldiers huddle against the cold of a Belgian winter. Some are awake on watch, others sleep in the profound exhaustion of men who have learnt to rest whenever possible. Private First Class Charles MacDonald of the 2nd Infantry Division would later write that, in the final seconds before the bombardment, the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. The war has been distant for weeks in this sector, reduced to occasional patrol contacts and harassing artillery fire. Then, at precisely 5:30 a.m., 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The earth convulsed, trees shattered. The air itself seemed to tear apart from the concussion. MacDonald's description was simple and terrible. The earth seemed to shake from the concussion. The largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940 had begun. The opening barrage was devastating in scale and precision. German artillery doctrine emphasized overwhelming fire concentration in the opening minutes of an attack, designed to destroy defensive positions, cut communications, and paralyze command structures through shock. For 30 minutes, high explosive and incendiary rounds pounded American positions along the entire front. Forward observation posts were obliterated in the first minutes, blinding American commanders. Communication wires were cut by explosions, isolating units from their headquarters. Ammunition dumps and fuel depots became secondary targets, several exploding in massive firestorms that lit the pre-dawn darkness. In villages immediately behind the front, soldiers were killed in their sleep as artillery rounds collapsed buildings. The noise was beyond description, a continuous roar that made thought impossible. Casualties in the first hour were estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing, many of them before they could react or even understand what was happening. The quiet sector had become an inferno. At 6 a.m., as the artillery barrage began to lift and roll forward, searchlights positioned behind German lines switched on. Their beams were directed upward, bouncing off the low cloud deck to create artificial moonlight that illuminated the battlefield. It was a technique developed on the Eastern Front, dramatically effective in winter conditions. In this eerie, diffused light, German infantry emerged from the forests. American soldiers still alive in their positions saw what appeared to be an endless line of men moving forward in the artificial twilight. A sergeant in the 99th Division later described the sight. It looked like a scene from hell, figures moving through smoke and snow with that weird light from above. The psychological impact was as significant as the material destruction. After months of defensive warfare and retreat, German soldiers were attacking with purpose and overwhelming numbers. For young American soldiers experiencing their first major combat, the shock was profound. 7 miles behind the front at Losheim, Joachim Peiper waited with mounting frustration. His Kampfgruppe was supposed to begin moving at 6 a.m., immediately behind the 12th Volksgrenadier Division that was tasked with breaking through American positions and clearing Rollbahn D. But the Volksgrenadiers were behind schedule. American resistance at Losheim Gap was fiercer than anticipated. A single regiment of the 99th Division, approximately 3,000 men, was holding against 12,000 attacking German infantry. The Americans had been battered by the artillery barrage but not broken. They fought from foxholes and bunkers, using interlocking fields of fire to stop German assault waves. Radio messages reaching Peiper's command post painted a frustrating picture. Infantry attacks were stalling, casualties were mounting, the road was not clear. Peiper's aggressive nature made waiting intolerable. His tanks sat with engines running, consuming precious fuel while accomplishing nothing. The operation was already behind schedule, and the spearhead hadn't even crossed the start line. By 2 p.m., 8 hours into the offensive, Peiper's frustration reached its breaking point. The Volksgrenadiers reported they were still fighting for positions they should have captured at dawn. The entire 6th SS Panzer Army main effort was stalled because infantry on foot and horses could not overcome determined American resistance. Peiper drove forward to personally confront the Volksgrenadier Division commander. The meeting was tense and documented by multiple witnesses. Peiper, 29 years old and wearing the Knight's Cross, faced a general old enough to be his father. "You are supposed to be 10 kilometers ahead," Peiper stated bluntly. "My tanks cannot wait for your infantry." The Volksgrenadier commander explained that American positions were stronger than intelligence had indicated, that his troops were fighting hard but making slow progress. Peiper's response was to dismiss the older officer's concerns and take matters into his own hands. He would bypass the stalled Volksgrenadiers and use his own reconnaissance battalion to force the breakthrough. It was a decision that reflected both tactical aggression and growing desperation. At 4 p.m., Peiper personally led his reconnaissance battalion forward, moving ahead of his main tank column. This was not standard procedure for a regimental commander, but Peiper had built his reputation on leading from the front. The reconnaissance unit consisted of armoured cars, half-tracks, and light vehicles designed for scouting, not breakthrough operations, but they were mobile and fast, and Peiper believed speed could compensate for light armour. The unit advanced through the darkening afternoon toward Lanzerath, a small village that marked the edge of the German penetration. Intelligence had reported Lanzerath was clear of American forces. Intelligence was wrong. At the approach to the village, Peiper's lead vehicles came under fire from an American roadblock. The engagement that followed would demonstrate both American resilience and the fragility of German planning. The roadblock at Lanzerath was held by 18 American soldiers, a reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Division that had been cut off during the morning bombardment. They were commanded by First Lieutenant Lyle Bauch, a 20-year-old officer who had won a battlefield commission for heroism in earlier fighting. Bauch's platoon occupied log-reinforced foxholes on a ridge overlooking the approaches to Lanzerath. They had 2 machine guns, rifles, and a clear field of fire. When Peiper's reconnaissance vehicles approached, Bauch ordered his men to hold fire until the Germans were at close range. The resulting ambush was devastatingly effective. Machine gun fire ripped into the lightly armoured vehicles, several exploded or crashed off the road. The German troops dismounted and attempted to assault the American position but were driven back by accurate rifle fire. For 3 hours, 18 Americans held an entire German battalion at bay. Peiper, monitoring the situation by radio from his command vehicle, could not believe that such a small force was stopping his advance. He ordered supporting artillery fire and infantry assaults. The Americans held until darkness and ammunition exhaustion finally forced their surrender. By the time Lanzerath was secured, it was 11 p.m. Kampfgruppe Peiper had consumed an entire day to advance 15 kilometers, less than a third of where the plan required them to be. The fighting across the entire front on December 16th revealed a pattern that would define the battle. German tactical successes failing to achieve operational objectives because of delays, fuel shortages, and unexpectedly fierce American resistance. The 6th SS Panzer Army, the strongest German force with the most critical mission, made the least progress. American units that were supposed to collapse held their positions for hours or even days, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Villages that should have been captured by noon were still contested at nightfall. Roads that should have been clear for German armour remained blocked by American roadblocks or destroyed bridges. By midnight on December 16th, the offensive had achieved surprise and local breakthroughs, but had not accomplished the rapid exploitation that was essential for success. Every hour of delay consumed fuel, allowed American reserves to move forward, and reduced the already slim chances of reaching the Meuse River. At his command post near Lanzerath, Peiper studied his maps by lamplight as midnight approached. His Kampfgruppe had finally broken through the American front line, but the cost in time was severe. The plan had called for his lead elements to be 40 kilometers forward by midnight, approaching Stavelot. Instead, they were only 15 kilometers from the start line, having consumed an entire day fighting through positions that intelligence had assessed as lightly held. Fuel consumption was ahead of projections because of the delays, with tanks idling for hours while waiting for infantry to clear the route. And now, in darkness and uncertain weather, Peiper had to make a decision: halt for the night and reorganize, or push forward immediately to make up lost time. Every instinct told him to attack. The SS had trained him to be aggressive, to maintain momentum, to never give the enemy time to recover. But attacking at night on unfamiliar roads through uncertain terrain risked blundering into ambushes or losing cohesion. It was the kind of tactical dilemma that could not be resolved by ideology or courage alone. Peiper's decision was characteristically aggressive. The Kampfgruppe would continue moving through the night. He would lead personally with the reconnaissance battalion and light tanks, followed by the main Panther and King Tiger formations. The column would drive through darkness on narrow roads with minimal illumination, risking confusion and vulnerability but maintaining the pressure on retreating Americans. It was a calculated gamble, the first of many Peiper would make in the days ahead. As his column began moving shortly after midnight, the men settling into the numbing routine of night movement, Peiper perhaps allowed himself a moment of optimism. The breakthrough had been achieved. American resistance at Lanzerath had been overcome. The road ahead was supposedly clear. Within hours, his lead elements would reach Honsfeld, where intelligence reported American supply dumps and rest camps. From there, it was a straight drive to Stavelot and the critical bridges. The operation was behind schedule but not yet failing. Speed and aggression could still compensate for the lost hours. What Peiper could not know in that cold December darkness was that his Kampfgruppe was about to enter the most controversial and consequential 48 hours of its existence, hours that would transform a military operation into a war crime and ensure that the name Kampfgruppe Peiper would be remembered not for tactical brilliance but for massacre. The night drive through the Ardennes had begun, and with it, the descent into actions that no amount of military success could justify or redeem. December 17th, 3 a.m. The lead tanks of Kampfgruppe Peiper grind through darkness toward Honsfeld, engines roaring in low gear, commanders peering through vision slits trying to navigate roads they cannot see clearly. Inside the cramped fighting compartment of Panther No. 207, the driver calls out fuel levels to his commander, 30% remaining. They have travelled barely 30 kilometres from the start line, and already fuel gauges show the tanks consuming reserves at alarming rates. The night movement, constant acceleration and deceleration, wrong turns in the darkness, all have burned fuel at rates far above planning estimates. The driver knows his tank consumes approximately 1 gallon per mile on roads, worse in snow or mud. The mathematics are brutal and simple. With current fuel loads, the Panthers can travel perhaps another 60 kilometres before running dry. The Meuse River is still more than 100 kilometres away. The entire Kampfgruppe is beginning a race against fuel exhaustion, a race they are already losing. The fuel crisis that would doom Kampfgruppe Peiper was not an unexpected development, but rather a calculated risk that German planners had accepted from the beginning. Every armoured operation in modern warfare is constrained by logistics, but the Ardennes offensive was uniquely dependent on capturing enemy supplies. German fuel production had collapsed under Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht's fuel situation was catastrophic. Training exercises were cancelled for lack of fuel. Luftwaffe squadrons sat grounded. Panzer divisions had enough fuel for a few days of operations at most. The offensive plan explicitly acknowledged this reality. Attacking forces would carry enough fuel to begin the assault, but reaching the Meuse would require capturing American fuel depots intact. It was an operational plan that depended on the enemy cooperating by leaving their supplies vulnerable. Military professionals understood this was a dangerous assumption, but Hitler insisted the psychological shock of the offensive would cause American units to abandon supplies in their retreat. It was wishful thinking elevated to strategic planning. At 6 a.m., Kampfgruppe Peiper overran Honsfeld, a small Belgian town that American forces had been using as a rest area. The attack came at dawn, Panthers and reconnaissance vehicles bursting into the town from unexpected directions, catching hundreds of American soldiers completely by surprise. Many were still sleeping. Some didn't have time to put on boots before being forced to surrender. The tactical success was complete and devastating. Over 300 Americans were captured in less than an hour. But Peiper's fuel officer, Captain Josef Diefenthal, was focused on a more critical target, the American fuel dump located on the edge of town. German intelligence had reported that Honsfeld contained significant fuel stocks. Diefenthal rushed to the dump to secure it before any retreating Americans could destroy it. What he found was both a victory and a problem. Approximately 50,000 gallons of fuel, but it was 80-octane aviation gasoline, not the diesel or higher-octane fuel German tanks required. The discovery of aviation fuel rather than appropriate tank fuel created an immediate technical dilemma. 80-octane aviation gasoline would damage German tank engines designed for higher-octane fuel. The lower octane rating would cause incomplete combustion engine knocking and potentially catastrophic mechanical failures. German tank engines were precision machines, products of careful engineering that required specific fuel to operate efficiently. Using inappropriate fuel was a guaranteed way to reduce engine life and risk breakdowns at critical moments. But Peiper's Kampfgruppe had no choice. Fuel was fuel, and running dry was worse than running damaged engines. At 9 a.m., Peiper gave the order that reflected his desperate situation. Mix the captured aviation fuel with the remaining proper fuel in each tank, diluting the aviation gasoline enough to hopefully prevent immediate engine damage while extending operational range. It was an improvisation born of necessity, acknowledging that the operation was already compromising its own equipment to continue. The refueling at Honsfeld consumed 90 critical minutes. Each tank had to maneuver to the fuel point, wait while crews manually pumped fuel from barrels into tanks, then move away to allow the next vehicle to refuel. The process was slow, exposed, and unavoidable. During those 90 minutes, Kampfgruppe Peiper was stationary and vulnerable. American artillery could have destroyed the entire formation if they had known its location. Allied fighter bombers could have turned the fuel dump into an inferno, but the weather remained overcast, grounding aircraft, and American forces were still reacting to the offensive, unsure where German spearheads were located. Peiper's luck held, but time was bleeding away. By the time the last vehicle was refueled and the column began moving toward Büllingen, it was mid-morning on December 17th. The operation's timeline called for Kampfgruppe Peiper to be approaching the Meuse by now. Instead, they were still 30 kilometers from the river crossings, having consumed a full day and a half to cover the first 30 kilometers. At 2 p.m., Kampfgruppe Peiper struck fuel lottery at Büllingen. The town, which had been a German military base before the September Allied advance, contained a major American fuel depot with over 124,000 gallons of appropriate tank fuel, along with lubricants, maintenance supplies, and ammunition. It was exactly what the operation required: high-quality fuel in quantities sufficient to sustain the offensive. The capture of Büllingen fuel dump was the single most important logistical success of Kampfgruppe Peiper's entire operation. With this fuel, the Kampfgruppe could reach the Meuse. Without it, the offensive would have stalled within hours. But again, refueling consumed precious time. The fuel was stored in 55-gallon drums that had to be manually loaded onto vehicles or pumped directly into tanks. The process was labor-intensive and slow. Crews worked frantically, knowing that every minute stationary was a minute American forces could use to organize defenses ahead. By the time refueling was complete, it was 6 p.m., darkness falling, and Kampfgruppe Peiper had consumed another 4 hours. The refueling delays at Honsfeld and Büllingen revealed a fundamental flaw in the offensive plan. Capturing fuel depots was possible, but using that captured fuel took time that the operation could not afford. The plan had assumed German forces would simply seize fuel and continue moving, as if fuel could be instantly transferred from American containers to German vehicles. Reality was messier. Fuel came in drums that had to be moved, pumping equipment had to be located or improvised, vehicles had to queue and wait their turn. And during all this time, the advance was halted, the timeline slipping further behind, and American reinforcements were moving toward the battle area. Each successful fuel capture paradoxically slowed the advance it was meant to sustain. It was a logistical catch-22 that German planners had not adequately considered. By 6 p.m. on December 17th, Peiper's lead tanks were approaching Stavelot with fuel gauges showing approximately 25% capacity. They had consumed the Honsfeld fuel, fighting through American resistance and the challenging terrain. The Büllingen fuel was loaded on trucks in the rear of the column, still 15 kilometers back and moving slowly through the traffic jam that was developing on the narrow roads. Peiper faced another agonizing decision: push forward with the lead elements on low fuel, hoping to capture another depot, or wait for the fuel trucks to catch up, losing more time but ensuring the entire Kampfgruppe could move together. His decision was to split the difference. The lead tanks would continue to Stavelot and beyond, while slower vehicles would wait for fuel trucks. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and would ultimately contribute to fragmenting the Kampfgruppe into isolated pockets. The fuel situation was not unique to Kampfgruppe Peiper, but symptomatic of the entire offensive. Across the Ardennes, German armoured units were finding that capturing fuel depots was more difficult than planned. American forces, once they understood the scale of the attack, began destroying supply dumps before retreating. The massive fuel depot at Spa, containing over 2.5 million gallons, was set afire on December 17th when American engineers realized German forces were approaching. The depot at Trois-Ponts, containing 400,000 gallons, would be destroyed before Peiper could reach it. Each destroyed depot reduced German operational range and increased the desperation of the fuel hunt. German tank commanders were making tactical decisions based not on enemy dispositions but on fuel availability. It was a humiliating reversal for an army that had once driven across Europe on captured fuel. Now, they were begging for enough gasoline to reach the next objective. The broader implications of the fuel crisis extended beyond Kampfgruppe Peiper's immediate tactical problems. Germany's inability to fuel its own offensive demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was no longer capable of sustained operations regardless of tactical success. Even if Peiper had reached the Meuse, even if bridges had been captured intact, even if American resistance had been lighter, the fundamental problem remained. Germany could not supply an advance 200 kilometers deep into enemy territory. The logistics that made Blitzkrieg possible in 1940 no longer existed. Allied bombing had destroyed the transportation infrastructure. Fuel production was a fraction of wartime requirements. The horse-drawn supply columns that supported the Volksgrenadier divisions could not keep pace with mechanized spearheads. The Ardennes offensive was revealing that Germany had the tactical capability to attack but not the operational capability to exploit success. It was an army that could still win battles but could no longer win campaigns. As darkness fell on December 17th and Kampfgruppe Peiper's lead elements approached Stavelot, fuel trucks still struggling to catch up through the traffic-choked roads, Peiper faced the reality that his operation was being strangled by logistics. The captured fuel at Büllingen had bought him perhaps 50 more kilometers of operational range, enough to reach the Meuse if everything went perfectly from this point forward. But nothing was going perfectly. American resistance was stiffening. Roads were worse than mapped, bridges were threatened, and the fuel gauge needles were dropping toward empty with every kilometer. The race to the Meuse had become a race against fuel exhaustion, and Peiper was losing. The panzers that should have been driving triumphantly toward the Allied rear were instead hunting desperately for gas stations, their operational tempo dictated not by tactical opportunity but by the distance to the next potential fuel source. It was a fitting metaphor for Germany's larger strategic situation, technically capable, tactically aggressive, but fundamentally unable to sustain operations because the industrial and logistical foundations of modern warfare had been destroyed. The fuel hunt that began in the dark, early morning hours of December 17th would continue until the operation's end, a constant background crisis that ensured that no matter how brave the soldiers or skilled the commanders, the offensive was doomed by mathematics as simple and brutal as gallons per mile. December 17th, 6 a.m., Honsfeld, Belgium. The dawn is grey and cold, fog clinging to the valleys, when the first Panther tanks of Kampfgruppe Peiper emerge from the forest road, like predators materializing from shadows. The town is completely unprepared. Over 300 American soldiers from various support units have been using Honsfeld as a rest area, sleeping in requisitioned houses and barns, their weapons stacked, their vehicles parked in neat rows along the streets. No one expected German tanks this far behind the front line. The American soldiers sleeping in the Café Baudaue are awakened not by alarms or orders, but by the distinctive sound of tank tracks on cobblestones and the sudden chatter of German machine guns. Private James Matera would later testify, "We didn't even have time to put on boots. We ran outside and saw Panthers everywhere, their guns pointing at us." The capture of Honsfeld was swift, efficient, and seemingly professional, but within minutes, the operation would cross a line from which there could be no return. The initial assault was a textbook example of armoured exploitation. Peiper's reconnaissance battalion and lead tanks entered Honsfeld from multiple directions simultaneously, cutting off escape routes and creating panic among the surprised Americans. Resistance was minimal. Most Americans surrendered immediately, hands raised, knowing that fighting lightly armed against tanks was suicide. Within 20 minutes, over 250 Americans were herded into the town square, guarded by SS troops while the advance continued. It appeared to be a standard tactical success, the kind of operation that German armoured forces had executed hundreds of times on the Eastern Front and in France. But Honsfeld was different. Among the SS troops of Kampfgruppe Peiper were men who had internalized lessons from the Eastern Front that had no place in the West, that prisoners were inconveniences, that the laws of war were obstacles to operational tempo, that enemies of the Reich deserved no mercy. What happened next would define Kampfgruppe Peiper's legacy more than any tactical success. At approximately 6:20 a.m., SS troops separated roughly 20 American prisoners from the larger group being held in the town square. Witnesses later testified that the selection appeared arbitrary, or perhaps based on which Americans looked like officers or were wearing equipment the Germans wanted. The 20 men were marched at gunpoint down a side street toward a field on the edge of town. Residents of Honsfeld, watching from their windows in terror, understood what was about to happen before the Americans did. Maria Limbuel, a Belgian woman whose house overlooked the field, watched as the prisoners were lined up. She heard German commands she could not understand. Then she heard the machine gun fire, a sustained burst lasting several seconds, followed by individual shots. When the SS troops walked away, 19 American soldiers lay dead or dying in the snow. One man, badly wounded, would survive by playing dead and would later provide testimony. The massacre at Honsfeld was the first documented war crime of Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance. It would not be the last. The killings at Honsfeld reveal the complexity and horror of what occurred during those December days. These were not random acts of violence by out-of-control soldiers. They were systematic murders carried out by troops operating within a command structure. The SS troops who committed the executions did so in proximity to their officers, in daylight, with witnesses present. Either these actions were ordered by the chain of command, or they were tolerated by commanders who knew war crimes were occurring and did nothing to stop them. Peiper himself was present in Honsfeld during the massacre, personally supervising the refueling operations and the advance. Whether he directly witnessed the killings is disputed. What is not disputed is that he commanded the unit that war crimes occurred under his command, and that as the senior officer present, he bore responsibility under military law for the actions of his subordinates. The doctrine of command responsibility, established at Nuremberg and reaffirmed at the later Malmedy trial, held commanders accountable for crimes they ordered, knew about and failed to stop, or should have known about given the circumstances. While the massacre was occurring on the edge of town, other SS troops were looting American supplies and equipment with professional efficiency. Vehicles were examined for fuel and usable equipment, weapons and ammunition were collected. Food rations were distributed to German soldiers who had been on reduced rations for months. The contrast between the organized military operation and the simultaneous war crimes created a surreal atmosphere. In the town square, German soldiers processed hundreds of American prisoners correctly, taking names and segregating officers according to the Geneva Conventions. 200 yards away, the bodies of 19 Americans lay in a field. It was as if two completely different wars were being fought simultaneously, one governed by military law and centuries of convention, another governed by the racial ideology and brutality that the SS had brought from the Eastern Front. The contradiction was not accidental. It reflected the fundamental duality of the Waffen-SS military formations that fought conventionally while simultaneously committing systematic atrocities. By 7:30 a.m., Kampfgruppe Peiper was moving out of Honsfeld toward Büllingen, leaving behind the captured prisoners under guard of follow-on forces and the bodies of the murdered Americans in the field. Belgian civilians emerged cautiously to check on the victims. Several were still alive, badly wounded, and bleeding in the freezing temperatures. Local residents provided what aid they could, moving wounded men into houses, covering the dead with blankets. It was these Belgian witnesses who would later provide critical testimony about what had occurred. Their accounts were detailed, consistent, and devastating. They could identify the uniforms, describe the vehicles, and specify the timing of events. Within days, American investigators would arrive to document the crime scene, photograph the bodies, and collect testimony. The evidence gathered at Honsfeld would become part of the larger war crimes investigation that eventually led to the Malmedy trial. At 10 a.m., Kampfgruppe Peiper struck Büllingen with the same overwhelming force that had taken Honsfeld. This time, the American unit present was a complete infantry battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 394th Infantry Regiment, nearly 500 men, but they were support troops, not frontline combat soldiers, and they were as surprised as the men at Honsfeld had been. The German attack was swift and coordinated. American resistance collapsed within minutes. The entire battalion surrendered, the largest single capture of American troops during Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance. The treatment of these prisoners was markedly different from Honsfeld. They were assembled, searched, and processed according to military protocols. Officers were separated from enlisted men. Wounded were allowed to remain with medics. No massacres occurred at Büllingen during the initial capture. It was another example of the unpredictable nature of the war crimes. Some American units were murdered, others were treated correctly, with no apparent pattern or logic to explain the difference. The contrast between the treatment of prisoners at different locations has never been satisfactorily explained. Defense attorneys at the Malmedy trial would argue that the killings were spontaneous acts by individual soldiers, not systematic policy. Prosecutors argued that the pattern of multiple killings at multiple locations demonstrated command policy, or at minimum command tolerance of war crimes. The truth likely lies somewhere between a command climate that emphasized speed and ruthlessness, explicitly ordering soldiers not to let prisoners slow the advance, combined with SS ideological training that dehumanized enemies, created conditions where war crimes were likely, even if not directly ordered. Individual soldiers made individual decisions to murder prisoners, but those decisions occurred within a context created by their commanders and their training. Peiper's defenders would point to the hundreds of American prisoners treated correctly as evidence he did not order massacres. Prosecutors would point to the dozens murdered as evidence of command responsibility for creating the conditions that made murder likely. While Kampfgruppe Peiper was looting Büllingen's fuel depot and processing prisoners, Joachim Peiper conducted a formal interrogation of a captured American major. The interrogation was witnessed by multiple people and conducted according to military protocol. Peiper asked detailed questions about fuel depot locations, bridge capacities, American troop dispositions, and defensive plans. The American officer, following the Geneva Conventions, provided only name, rank, and serial number. Peiper did not threaten or abuse the prisoner, but simply noted his non-cooperation and had him sent to the rear with other POWs. The interrogation demonstrated that Peiper understood military law and was capable of following it when he chose to. This makes his command responsibility for the massacres more, not less, damning. He knew the rules. He had the authority to enforce them. War crimes occurred anyway, repeatedly, under his command. Whether through direct orders, implicit approval, or negligent failure to prevent crimes he should have anticipated, Peiper created the conditions for the atrocities that followed. By 11 a.m., Kampfgruppe Peiper was departing Büllingen, leaving behind the captured prisoners and the looted town. The column stretched for kilometres, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, self-propelled guns, all moving west towards Stavelot and the critical bridges. For the German soldiers in the column, the morning had been a stunning success. 2 towns captured, hundreds of prisoners taken, desperately needed fuel secured, American forces thrown into confusion. The tactical achievements were undeniable, but the moral rot was already spreading through the operation. The murder of prisoners at Honsfeld had established a precedent. Word spread through the Kampfgruppe that some units were not bothering to process prisoners, that speed was more important than Geneva Conventions, that the rules from the Eastern Front applied here too. Within hours, this toxic combination of tactical success and moral collapse would produce the most infamous atrocity of the Battle of the Bulge. The massacres at Honsfeld and Büllingen were preludes. The main act was still to come at a crossroads 2 kilometres south of Malmedy, where 84 American soldiers would be murdered in a field, and the name Kampfgruppe Peiper would become synonymous with war crimes. The morning of December 17th had revealed what kind of operation this would be. Tactically brilliant, logistically desperate, and morally catastrophic. The pattern was established. The question was not whether more atrocities would occur, but only where and when. December 17th, 4 p.m. Jacques Gevers pedals his bicycle frantically along the road from Stavelot toward Trois-Ponts. his breath coming in, gasps, legs burning from exertion. The Belgian resistance fighter has just witnessed something that terrifies him. A column of German tanks, dozens of them, moving through Stavelot and heading directly toward the bridges at Trois-Ponts. Gevers knows what those bridges mean. The Amblève and Somme rivers converge at Trois-Ponts, creating a natural obstacle that can only be crossed at a few points. If the Germans capture those bridges intact, nothing stands between them and the Meuse River. If the bridges can be destroyed, the German advance stops here. Gevers has perhaps 30 minutes before the German tanks arrive. His bicycle ride through the gathering darkness, racing to warn the American engineers at Trois-Ponts, is a desperate attempt to buy time. He does not know it yet, but his warning will change the entire course of Kampfgruppe Peiper's offensive and possibly the outcome of the battle itself. At Trois-Ponts, Captain Ralph Gamble commands Company C of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. His unit consists of 140 men total, but most are dispersed across the region on various assignments. At Trois-Ponts itself, Gamble has exactly 11 engineers. Their mission is to maintain the bridges and keep the roads clear for American supply traffic. They are not combat troops. They have minimal weapons, a few rifles, some carbines, no heavy weapons at all. When Gevers arrives at 4:15 p.m. and reports that German tanks are approaching, Gamble's first reaction is disbelief. German tanks this far behind American lines seems impossible. But Gevers is insistent, describing what he saw in detail. Panthers, King Tigers, half-tracks, a massive armoured column moving fast. Gamble makes a snap decision based on incomplete information and institutional training. If there is even a chance German armour is approaching, the bridges must be prepared for demolition. He orders his 11 engineers to break out the TNT. The preparation of bridges for demolition is skilled technical work that normally takes hours. Charges must be placed precisely at structural weak points, wired together for simultaneous detonation, and tested to ensure they will fire when needed. The engineers at Trois-Ponts have 500 pounds of TNT and the knowledge to use it, but they do not have time. Gamble assigns teams to the three critical bridges: the main bridge over the Amblève River on the road to Stavelot, a second bridge over the Somme River on the southern approach, and a railroad bridge that could potentially be used by German forces. The engineers work frantically, drilling holes in stone and concrete, packing explosive charges, stringing detonation wire. Sergeant Jean Miller, working on the Amblève Bridge, would later describe the experience. "My hands were shaking so bad I could barely connect the detonator. We could hear the tank engines getting closer. They are working against time, against approaching darkness, and against the knowledge that if the Germans arrive before the charges are set, 11 engineers with rifles cannot stop them." At 4:30 p.m, Peiper's reconnaissance unit reaches the high ground overlooking Trois-Ponts from the east. Through binoculars, German officers can see the bridges clearly in the fading light. They appear intact, undefended, open for crossing. The Amblève River Bridge is a substantial stone and concrete structure, clearly strong enough to support the heaviest tanks. Beyond it, the road continues west toward open country and the Meuse River. After 2 days of frustrating delays and constant combat, the objective seems finally within reach. A radio message goes back to Peiper: "Bridges at Trois-Ponts in sight, appear intact, no visible defences." Peiper, travelling with the main column several kilometres back, receives the message with satisfaction. Capture those bridges and the operation succeeds. Lose them and the entire advance must detour north or south, adding hours and consuming fuel he does not have. He orders maximum speed toward Trois-Ponts. The race is now measured in minutes. At 4:42 p.m, the lead German reconnaissance vehicles begin their approach to the Amblève Bridge. They are moving fast, trying to reach the bridge before American forces can react. Sergeant Miller, crouched behind a stone wall with the detonator in his hands, watches them come. The timing is critical. Detonate too early, and the Germans will simply find another crossing point. Detonate too late, and German soldiers might reach the bridge and cut the detonation wires. Miller waits until the lead Panther is 75 yards from the bridge, close enough that the Germans can see the bridge as their objective, close enough that they begin accelerating toward it. Then Miller pushes the detonator plunger. 200 pounds of TNT packed into drilled holes in the stone bridge abutments detonate simultaneously. The center span of the bridge lifts into the air in a cloud of dust and debris, then collapses into the river. The explosion echoes off the valley walls. When the dust clears, the Amblève River Bridge at Trois-Ponts is a ruin, impassable to any vehicle. The German advance has been stopped cold. The German reaction is immediate and violent. Machine gun fire rakes the positions where the engineers are working on the second bridge over the Salm River. Mortars begin falling on the town. German infantry dismount from half-tracks and begin advancing toward the river, seeking alternate crossing points. But Captain Gamble has already given the order. At 5 p.m., as German troops close on the Salm Bridge, the engineers detonate the charges. The steel truss bridge collapses in a screaming tear of metal, its center span falling into the river. 2 bridges destroyed in 15 minutes. The German advance has lost its direct route to the Meuse. Peiper, arriving at the scene shortly after 5 p.m., stares at the collapsed bridges in disbelief and frustration. Multiple witnesses, both German and American, reported his statement, "Those damned engineers. Those damned engineers." It was an acknowledgement that 11 American soldiers with TNT had accomplished what entire divisions could not. They had stopped Kampfgruppe Peiper. The tactical situation at Trois-Ponts was now critically clear. The Amblève and Salm rivers formed a V-shaped obstacle, with Trois-Ponts at the junction. Both bridges across these rivers were destroyed. The only alternative crossings were kilometres away, requiring Peiper to backtrack and detour either north or south from his assigned route. Every alternative added distance and consumed fuel his Kampfgruppe could not spare. Moreover, the delay gave American forces time to organize defenses at whatever crossing Peiper chose next. The destruction of the Trois-Ponts bridges transformed the entire operational situation. What had been a race to the Meuse became a desperate search for any way across the rivers that blocked Peiper's path. The strategic advantage had shifted to the Americans, who now knew where the German spearhead was located and could concentrate forces to contain it. What made the Trois-Ponts bridge demolition particularly devastating was the fuel depot located in the town. American forces had stockpiled approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel at Trois-Ponts, intended to supply the First Army's advance into Germany. When engineers realized German forces were approaching, they set fire to the fuel dump. The resulting conflagration lit the evening sky, visible for miles. Those 400,000 gallons represented more fuel than Kampfgruppe Peiper's entire allocation for the offensive. If captured intact, that fuel would have sustained Peiper's advance all the way to the Meuse and beyond. Instead, it burned uselessly while Peiper's tanks idled with near-empty fuel gauges, unable to cross the destroyed bridges. The combination of the demolished bridges and the burned fuel depot at Trois-Ponts represented a logistical catastrophe from which Kampfgruppe Peiper would never recover. The broader significance of Trois-Ponts extended beyond Kampfgruppe Peiper. The 6th SS Panzer Army's entire offensive depended on rapid exploitation by armoured spearheads. When Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the most powerful and fastest-moving formation, was stopped at Trois-Ponts, the entire northern thrust of the offensive stalled. Other Kampfgruppen attempting to follow Peiper's route found themselves backed up behind his immobilized column. The single narrow road through the Ardennes that was supposed to be a highway to the Meuse became instead a parking lot of frustrated German armour. American commanders, monitoring the situation from higher headquarters, began to understand that if they could keep destroying bridges and blocking roads, the German offensive could be contained regardless of tactical defeats at the front line. Engineer units, previously considered support troops, suddenly became the most critical forces on the battlefield. The 29th Regiment of the 91st Engineer Battalion received orders to prepare every bridge in the region for demolition. The battle was becoming a race between German tanks trying to find intact bridges and American engineers trying to destroy them. At Trois-Ponts itself, as darkness fell on December 17th, the situation stabilized into a tense standoff. German forces held the eastern bank of the rivers but could not cross. American engineers, reinforced by infantry companies rushing to the scene, held the western bank. Machine gun fire was exchanged across the water. German mortars probed for American positions. But without a bridge, Peiper's heavy tanks were irrelevant. A King Tiger on the wrong side of a river is just an expensive pillbox. Peiper held another conference with his officers, studying maps by lamplight, considering options. He could retreat 5 kilometres and seek a ford across the Amblève, north of Trois-Ponts, but the detour would take him off Rollbahn D and into unknown territory. He could continue south, seeking another bridge, but that route led away from his objective. Or he could wait for German engineers to construct a temporary bridge, but building a bridge capable of supporting 70-ton tanks under American fire was impossible. Every option was bad, and every hour of delay made the situation worse. Peiper's decision, made around 6 p.m., was to detour north toward the village of Gleize. hoping to find a crossing or a bridge at Rollbahn beyond. It was the only option that kept moving toward the Meuse, even if the route was uncertain. But giving the order to move north meant abandoning Rollbahn D, the carefully planned route that was supposed to lead directly to the objective. It meant navigating unfamiliar roads in darkness, with fuel running low and American forces now alerted to his position. The destruction of the Trois-Ponts bridges forced Peiper into improvisation, and improvisation was the enemy of the operation's tight timeline and minimal fuel margin. As his column began the laborious process of turning around on narrow roads and moving north, Peiper must have understood that the offensive's critical moment had passed. The bridges at Trois-Ponts were the key to the entire operation. Losing them meant losing the race to the Meuse. What followed would be increasingly desperate attempts to salvage an operation that was already, in strategic terms, finished. The damned engineers and their TNT had accomplished what entire armies could not. They had stopped the spearhead. And without the spearhead, the entire offensive would eventually collapse into the brutal defensive battle that would characterize the remainder of the Ardennes campaign. Trois-Ponts was where Kampfgruppe Peiper's offensive died, even though the fighting would continue for days more. December 17th, 6 p.m., a cafe in Stavelot, hastily converted into a command post. Joachim Peiper spreads maps across a table, still sticky with spilled beer, the electric lights flickering as German generators struggle with the load. Around him, his battalion commanders stand in mud-caked uniforms, exhaustion visible on every face. The news from Trois-Ponts has forced this emergency conference. The bridges are gone, the direct route to the Meuse blocked, and the entire Kampfgruppe is now backed up on a single road with nowhere to go. Peiper's finger traces a route north from their current position through La Gleize towards Stavelot and Rollbahn. Intelligence reports suggest there may be intact bridges on this northern route, but it is a detour, adding 20 kilometers to a journey that is already consuming fuel faster than captured supplies can replace it. Worse, American forces are now fully aware of Kampfgruppe Peiper's location. The element of surprise is gone. Radio intercepts indicate American reinforcements are moving toward the area. Every hour of delay allows the enemy to strengthen defenses and close escape routes. Peiper faces a decision that will determine the fate of his entire force. The plan Peiper announces at 7:30 p.m. reflects both tactical aggression and growing desperation. The Kampfgruppe will split into two elements. Peiper himself will take the strongest units, the Panthers, King Tigers, and elite reconnaissance troops, approximately 100 vehicles total, and drive north through La Gleize towards Stavelot. Intelligence suggests Stavelot sits on a ridge overlooking the Amblève River with a bridge at Targnon just beyond, potentially the last viable crossing to reach the Meuse. The second element, consisting of Panzer IVs, half-tracks carrying infantry, and all support vehicles, approximately 500 vehicles, will remain in the Stavelot area to secure the supply line and wait for fuel convoys from Germany. It is a calculated gamble based on the assumption that the rear element can hold Stavelot and that fuel trucks can fight through the increasingly chaotic German rear areas to resupply the forward element. Both assumptions are optimistic at best, delusional at worst. But Peiper has no good options remaining, only choices between different degrees of risk. The decision to split the Kampfgruppe violated fundamental principles of armoured warfare. An armoured formation's strength comes from concentration of force. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and support working together as a combined arms team. Separated, each element becomes vulnerable. Tanks without infantry support are exposed to close-range anti-tank weapons. Infantry without tank support cannot break through prepared defences. Artillery, separated from the units it supports, cannot provide effective fire missions. But Peiper's fuel situation left him no choice. His heaviest tanks, the King, Tigers, and Panthers, consumed fuel at rates that made keeping the entire column together impossible. The slower vehicles and support units would have to fend for themselves while the spearhead made one final push toward the objective. It was triage, sacrificing the rear to give the front a chance at success. In hindsight, it was the moment Kampfgruppe Peiper ceased to function as a coherent military formation and became instead a collection of isolated units fighting separate battles. By 8 a.m. on December 18th, Peiper's vanguard had covered the 15 kilometers to Stavelot and occupied the village. The advance had been remarkably easy, encountering only light American screening forces. From Stavelot's high ground, German officers could see the Amblève Valley stretching toward Rollbahn, and beyond that, the open country that led to the Meuse. They were now just 5 kilometers from the bridge at Targnon, the closest Kampfgruppe Peiper would ever get to a viable river crossing. For a brief moment, it seemed the detour had worked. But American commanders had spent December 17th rushing reinforcements to exactly this sector. The 30th Infantry Division, a veteran formation that had fought from Normandy through France, was taking up positions between Stavelot and the Meuse. The 119th Infantry Regiment, with attached tank destroyers, was digging in along the approach to Targnon Bridge. What Peiper saw as open ground was actually a killing zone being prepared by experienced troops with adequate weapons and clear fields of fire. At 2 p.m. on December 18th, Peiper ordered a reconnaissance in force toward Targnon. A company of Panthers with mounted infantry pushed down the road from Stavelot, moving cautiously through the winter landscape. They advanced perhaps 2 kilometers before running into a carefully prepared American ambush. Tank destroyers positioned in hull-down positions opened fire at close range. Bazookas fired from concealed positions beside the road. Artillery that had been pre-registered on likely German approach routes began falling with precision. The lead Panthers were hit and disabled within minutes. Infantry dismounted and tried to flank the American positions but were stopped by interlocking machine gun fire. After an hour of intense combat, the German force withdrew to Stavelot, having lost 3 tanks and dozens of infantry without even reaching the bridge. It was the first time in the offensive that Kampfgruppe Peiper had been stopped by American armoured resistance rather than destroyed bridges or fuel shortages. The Americans were no longer retreating in confusion. They were fighting back with skill and determination. While Peiper's forward element was being bloodied at Stavelot, catastrophe was unfolding at Stavelot. The 117th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Division launched a counterattack at 2 p.m. on December 18th to retake the town. They advanced with infantry and tanks in coordinated assault, the kind of combined arms operation that the Americans had perfected over months of combat. The German rear guard in Stavelot, consisting of support troops and light vehicles commanded by officers junior to Peiper, was not prepared for a determined counterattack. They fought hard, but by 6 p.m., American forces had retaken most of Stavelot. More critically, they had cut Rollbahn, severing Peiper's supply line to the main German forces. The radio message that reached Peiper at his forward command post in Stavelot was devastating in its simplicity. "We cannot hold. Americans have retaken the town." With those words, Kampfgruppe Peiper became isolated, cut off from resupply, reinforcement, or retreat. By nightfall on December 18th, Peiper's situation had transformed from challenging to desperate. He commanded approximately 800 men and 60 tanks, trapped in a salient that extended 15 kilometers into American-held territory and was only 3 kilometers wide. Behind him, Stavelot was in American hands, blocking the only road back to German lines. Ahead, strong American forces blocked every approach to the remaining bridges. His fuel situation was critical. Tanks had perhaps 30 kilometers of range remaining, not enough to fight through to the Meuse, and certainly not enough to fight back to German lines. Food was running low. Ammunition for tank main guns was being rationed. Medical supplies were inadequate for the wounded already accumulated. And radio intercepts indicated that American forces were converging on his position from 3 directions: the 82nd Airborne Division from the north, the 30th Division from the west, and the 3rd Armoured Division from the south. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, which 72 hours earlier had been the spearhead of Germany's last great offensive, was now surrounded and fighting for survival. The radio conversation between Peiper and 6th Panzer Army headquarters on the evening of December 18th revealed the growing disconnect between the tactical reality at the front and the strategic fantasy at higher command. Peiper reported his situation in detail. Isolated, low on fuel and ammunition, unable to advance or retreat, facing growing American strength. He requested immediate relief by other Kampfgruppen or permission to break out toward German lines. The response from headquarters was both predictable and useless. Hold position, relief forces are being organised, the offensive must continue. Peiper understood what this meant. There were no relief forces. The roads behind him were clogged with traffic jams. Other Kampfgruppen attempting to follow his route were stalled or destroyed. He was being ordered to hold an indefensible position because admitting the offensive had failed was unacceptable to commanders who had promised Hitler victory. It was a familiar pattern from the Eastern Front. Impossible orders, no support, and the expectation that SS fanaticism would somehow overcome logistical and tactical reality. The splitting of Kampfgruppe Peiper had one unintended consequence that would prove significant in the days ahead. It concentrated the most combat-capable units in a relatively small area around Gleize and Stavelot. Peiper now commanded approximately 800 of his best troops, his heaviest tanks including multiple King Tigers, and officers and men who had survived years of brutal combat. This was a force capable of extraordinary defensive fighting, even though offensive operations were no longer possible. The Americans closing in on Peiper's pocket would discover that defeating an isolated but well-equipped SS formation was entirely different from defeating a retreating or demoralized enemy. The Panthers and King Tigers, immobilized for lack of fuel, became fixed gun positions with excellent fields of fire. The villages of Gleize and Stavelot, with their stone buildings, became natural fortresses. The SS troops, trained to fight to the last round, prepared for a siege that would test both sides to their limits. As December 18th ended, the strategic situation of the entire Ardennes offensive was clarifying. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of 6th Panzer Army's main effort, was trapped and isolated. Other German units attempting to exploit initial successes were stalling against stiffening American resistance. The weather, which had provided low clouds to shield German movements, was forecast to clear, meaning Allied air power would soon enter the battle. Fuel shortages were crippling operations across the entire front. American reinforcements were arriving faster than German planners had anticipated. The offensive that was supposed to reach the Meuse in 48 hours had consumed 3 days and achieved only a series of shallow penetrations that were now being contained. The splitting of Kampfgruppe Peiper was not the cause of the offensive's failure, but rather a symptom of deeper problems: inadequate fuel, unrealistic planning, underestimation of American capabilities, and the fundamental disconnect between Nazi ideology's faith in willpower and the material realities of modern warfare. For the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper, trapped in their shrinking pocket around Gleize, the broader strategic situation was less relevant than immediate survival. They were surrounded by enemies, short on supplies, unable to advance or retreat, and facing the prospect of either death in combat or surrender to forces that knew about the massacres at Honsfeld and Malmedy. The decision to split the Kampfgruppe had been based on sound tactical reasoning, given impossible circumstances, but sound tactics could not overcome strategic failure. No amount of courage or skill at the tactical level could compensate for an offensive launched without adequate fuel, supplies, or realistic objectives. The men in Gleize would fight on because they were soldiers and had been ordered to hold, but the operation they had been sent to execute had already failed. The splitting of Kampfgruppe Peiper was the formal acknowledgement of that failure, even if Peiper himself was not yet ready to admit it. The question now was not whether the offensive would succeed, but how many men would die before the inevitable end. And for the Americans closing in on the isolated German pocket, the question was how to destroy or capture this dangerous force without suffering unacceptable casualties in the process. The siege of Gleize was beginning, and it would become one of the most intense small unit actions of the entire Battle of the Bulge. December 17th, 12:30 p.m., the Borniez Crossroads, 2 kilometers south of the town of Malmedy, Lieutenant Virgil Larry of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, signals his convoy to halt at the intersection. His unit consists of 140 men in 30 vehicles, mostly lightly armed trucks and jeeps, carrying surveyors, radio operators, and forward observers. These are not frontline combat troops, but technical specialists whose job is to direct artillery fire. They have been driving through the Ardennes all morning, reassigned from one sector to another in the confusion following the German offensive. The intersection ahead looks clear. The road to the left leads to Malmedy. The road straight ahead continues toward Ligneuville. Larry has orders to proceed to Ligneuville. As the first vehicles enter the intersection, German vehicles suddenly appear from the right, travelling at high speed on the road from Stavelot. The two columns, American and German, converge at the crossroads simultaneously, neither expected to encounter the enemy here. For a handful of seconds, soldiers on both sides simply stare at each other in mutual surprise. The firefight that follows is brief and one-sided. The German vehicles are Panthers and half-tracks from the following element of Kampfgruppe Peiper, commanded by Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke. They are heavily armed combat vehicles with machine guns and cannons. The American vehicles are thin-skinned trucks with no armor and minimal weapons. Several American soldiers attempt to fight, firing rifles and carbines at the tanks, a hopeless gesture. Larry tries to organize a defense, but the situation is impossible. Within minutes, German machine guns have disabled the lead American vehicles and killed or wounded dozens of soldiers. The survivors do the only rational thing: they surrender. Hands go up across the convoy. Soldiers emerge from vehicles, shouting that they are surrendering. The shooting stops. Approximately 120 Americans are herded together at gunpoint, hands on their heads, directed into a snow-covered field beside the Café Badawi. It appears to be a standard tactical situation. One unit surprised another. Combat occurred. The losing side surrendered and is being taken prisoner. Everything up to this point follows the laws of war. What happens in the next 30 minutes will become the most infamous war crime on the Western Front. The German troops guarding the American prisoners are SS men from the 1st SS Panzer Battalion, part of Kampfgruppe Peiper's main column. They are not Peiper's personal vanguard, which has already passed through this intersection an hour earlier, but follow-on units moving toward the front. The prisoners are being held in the field, while German officers decide what to do with them. Standard military procedure would be to search the prisoners, segregate officers, and march them to the rear under guard for processing. But Kampfgruppe Peiper has been explicitly ordered to maintain speed, to not let anything slow the advance, to drive for the Meuse without regard to flanks or losses. Taking time to properly process over 100 prisoners would require vehicles, guards, and hours that the operation cannot spare. More troublingly, word has spread through the Kampfgruppe about the earlier prisoner killings at Honsfeld. An informal consensus has emerged among some units that prisoners are inconveniences to be eliminated rather than responsibilities to be protected. The Americans standing in the field, cold and scared but expecting to be treated according to military convention, have no idea of the toxic combination of operational pressure and ideological brutality that is about to converge on them. At approximately 1:15 p.m, the character of the situation changes abruptly. 2 pistol shots ring out, fired into the grouped prisoners by an SS officer whose identity would be disputed for decades. Whether these shots are a signal or spontaneous murder is unclear. What is clear is that immediately following those pistol shots, machine gun fire erupts from multiple German positions around the field. The MG-42 machine guns, firing at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, rake the grouped Americans with sustained bursts. Men fall in waves, cut down where they stand, bodies piling on top of bodies. The killing continues for 5 to 7 minutes of sustained fire. Then the shooting stops. Approximately 84 Americans lie dead or dying in the snow. Survivors, perhaps 40 men, play dead among the corpses, holding their breath, praying the Germans will leave. But the SS troops are thorough. They walk among the bodies, firing individual shots into any man who shows signs of life. Private Kenneth Ahrens, lying beneath 2 dead comrades, hears German voices approaching, hears the pistol shots as wounded men are executed, feels blood from the men above him soaking through his uniform. He survives only because the Germans fail to notice he is alive. The massacre continues beyond the initial killing. Over the next 30 minutes, SS troops methodically execute wounded Americans who are moving or groaning. They loot the bodies, taking watches, cigarettes, personal items. Several survivors later testified that they heard German laughter, suggesting some perpetrators found amusement in the atrocity. When American prisoners attempted to surrender again, hands raised, begging for mercy, they were shot down. The SS troops showed no hesitation, no apparent moral conflict about what they were doing. They were murdering unarmed men who had surrendered under rules of war that had been observed by armies for centuries, and they were doing it casually, as if killing prisoners was a routine part of military operations. The cultural and ideological distance between the Wehrmacht of 1940 and the SS of 1944 was measured in these acts. The SS had internalized the lessons of the Eastern Front. Enemy soldiers were not fellow professionals deserving respect, but racial enemies deserving annihilation. At approximately 3:30 p.m, several hours after the massacre, survivors begin emerging from the field. Private Homer Ford had been shot in the arm during the initial burst but had fallen and been covered by other bodies. When the Germans finally left, he waited in terrified silence, unsure if SS troops were still watching the field. Eventually, he crawled from beneath the corpses and ran for the woods. He encountered other survivors doing the same. Together, they made their way through the forest toward American lines. Their testimony, delivered to frontline units within hours and to formal investigators within a day, was consistent, detailed, and horrifying. The soldiers had been assembled after surrendering. They had been machine-gunned while their hands were raised. Wounded men had been systematically executed. The number of dead was approximately 84. The Americans who heard these accounts reacted with rage and disbelief. 43 survivors eventually reached safety, each carrying the physical and psychological wounds of what they had witnessed and endured. The immediate impact of the Malmedy massacre on American forces was profound and long-lasting. By December 19th, 48 hours after the massacre, word had spread throughout American units across the Ardennes. The story was told and retold, often with embellishments, creating a narrative of SS brutality that may have exceeded the actual horror but captured the emotional truth. American soldiers were told explicitly and implicitly, "Do not surrender to SS units. They murder prisoners." The tactical effect was to stiffen American resistance. Soldiers who might have surrendered when surrounded chose to fight to the last round, rather than risk capture by the SS. The strategic effect was to transform American perception of the battle from a conventional military operation into a struggle against an enemy that had abandoned the laws of war. The massacre turned the Battle of the Bulge personal in a way that earlier fighting had not been. This was no longer just about defending territory or destroying enemy forces. It was about defeating an army that committed atrocities. Within 48 hours of the massacre, Belgian civilians provided critical corroboration and documentation. Residents of Bognes and nearby Malmedy had witnessed the event from houses and farms overlooking the crossroads. They had seen American soldiers herded into the field. They had heard the machine gun fire. After the SS troops departed, they ventured out to the field and found the frozen bodies lying in the snow. Several civilians took photographs, documenting the scene before snow and time could obscure the evidence. Others provided aid to wounded survivors who emerged from the field. This civilian testimony would prove crucial at the later war crimes trial because it came from neutral witnesses with no military or political stake in the outcome. The Belgian witnesses confirmed every essential element of the survivors' accounts. The prisoners had been assembled after surrender, they had been machine-gunned as a group, and wounded had been systematically executed. The physical evidence supported the testimony. Forensic examination of the bodies showed bullet wounds to the head at close range, the signature of execution rather than combat casualties. The Malmedy massacre was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern. Between December 16th and December 21st, Kampfgruppe Peiper murdered approximately 350 American prisoners and Belgian civilians at multiple locations. The killings at Honsfeld on December 17th murdered 19 Americans. The massacre at Bognes Crossroads on December 17th murdered 84. Additional murders occurred at Ligneuville, Stavelot, Chenot, and a dozen smaller locations. The pattern was consistent. Prisoners taken, assembled, and murdered by shooting. In each case, the perpetrators were units of Kampfgruppe Peiper operating under time pressure to maintain the advance. The cumulative evidence suggested either a policy of murdering prisoners to avoid slowing the operation, or at minimum a command climate where such murders were tolerated. Either way, Joachim Peiper bore command responsibility. Whether he directly ordered the massacres or created conditions that made them likely, military law held commanders accountable for the actions of their subordinates. The legal and historical debate about Peiper's personal guilt would continue for decades. His defenders argued that he was not present at Malmedy when the massacre occurred, that he did not order prisoners killed, that individual soldiers made independent criminal decisions. Prosecutors argued that Peiper commanded the Kampfgruppe, that multiple massacres under his command demonstrated systemic criminality, that he created or tolerated a culture where war crimes were acceptable. The truth, as with most command responsibility cases, was complex. Peiper was not personally at Bognes firing the machine guns, but he commanded the unit that committed the massacre. He had set the operational tempo that created pressure to eliminate prisoners. He had trained and led men who brought Eastern Front brutality to the West. He had failed to prevent crimes that, given the pattern of earlier killings, he should have anticipated. Under the doctrine of command responsibility established at Nuremberg, these failures constituted criminal liability. As darkness fell on December 17th and the bodies of 84 American soldiers lay freezing in the field at Bognes, the character of the Ardennes offensive had fundamentally changed. What began as a conventional military operation had become a campaign marked by atrocity. American soldiers would fight with increased determination, knowing surrender might mean death. International opinion, which might have been sympathetic to German soldiers fighting a defensive battle, turned against an army that murdered prisoners. The massacre ensured that Kampfgruppe Peiper and its commander would be remembered not for tactical skill or operational audacity, but for war crimes. The men who died at Malmedy crossroads became symbols of the difference between soldiers who fight within laws of war and soldiers who abandon those laws in pursuit of victory. Their deaths transformed the Battle of the Bulge from a military event into a moral reckoning about the nature of the SS and the limits of military honour. The frozen field at Bonnières became a crime scene that would haunt survivors, prosecutors, and historians for generations. And the name Malmedy became synonymous with the darkest aspects of the Second World War, a reminder that even in the final months of the conflict, new horrors could still emerge from the depths of Nazi ideology and SS training. December 18th, 10 a.m., an American reconnaissance aircraft flies over the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes at 3,000 feet, its cameras clicking methodically every few seconds. The pilot maintains steady altitude and speed, following the pre-planned route that traces the roads from the German border towards Stavelot. When the photographic analysts develop the film later that afternoon, they will see something extraordinary. A continuous line of German vehicles stretching 25 kilometers from Stavelot back to the German frontier. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, supply wagons, all sitting motionless on a single narrow road through the forest. The photographs show vehicles backed up at every curve, every intersection, every bridge. In some locations, the traffic extends 3 or 4 vehicles wide, as commanders have attempted to bypass bottlenecks by driving off-road, only to become stuck in the mud or snow. The images document the death of Blitzkrieg, the transformation of Germany's last great offensive from rapid mobile warfare into a static traffic jam that Allied fighter bombers will soon turn into a killing ground. The traffic collapse behind Kampfgruppe Peiper was the inevitable result of trying to move a modern, mechanized army through medieval infrastructure. The roads through the Ardennes were adequate for civilian traffic, farm vehicles, and light military transport. They were never designed for the concentrated movement of thousands of armoured vehicles. The operational plan had assumed that once the initial breakthrough was achieved, German columns would spread across multiple roads, dispersing the traffic load. But the breakthrough had not developed as planned. American resistance created bottlenecks that forced all traffic onto the few roads that had been cleared. The result was a concentration of vehicles that overwhelmed the road network's capacity. Every disabled vehicle, every wrong turn, every moment of confusion cascaded into delays that affected hundreds of vehicles behind it. The Germans were discovering what logistics officers had known since ancient times. An army moves only as fast as its slowest element, and when everything is forced onto one road, everything moves at the speed of the slowest vehicle on that road. At 2 p.m. on December 18th, the situation reached crisis proportions at the crossroads near Recht, 15 kilometers behind Peiper's forward positions. 3 separate German formations converged on the single intersection simultaneously. Kampfgruppe Peiper's supply column, attempting to carry fuel and ammunition forward to the isolated spearhead, approached from the west. Kampfgruppe Hansen of the 1st SS Panzer Division, attempting to follow Peiper's route and exploit his breakthrough, approached from the south. Elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, ordered to reinforce the stalled offensive, approached from the east. None of these formations had been effectively coordinated by higher headquarters. No military police controlled the intersection. No traffic control plan allocated priority. The result was predictable chaos. Vehicles blocked each other at the crossroads. Commanders argued about who had priority. Columns backed up for kilometers in every direction. For 6 hours, some of Germany's most powerful military formations sat immobilized at a country crossroads, unable to advance, unable to retreat, accomplishing nothing except consuming fuel while their engines idled. The breakdown of German traffic management revealed how thoroughly the Wehrmacht's organizational capabilities had degraded since 1940. When German armies drove through France in May and June of that year, they moved multiple divisions, hundreds of kilometers, with remarkable efficiency. Traffic control was strict, routes were coordinated, bottlenecks were anticipated and avoided. Military police regulated intersections, engineers rapidly repaired damaged roads, supply columns were sequenced to arrive when and where needed. That organizational competence, built on decades of professional military tradition and detailed staff planning, had been destroyed by 5 years of war. Experienced staff officers were dead or captured. Replacement officers lacked training in large-scale logistics. Communication systems were degraded by Allied bombing and equipment shortages. The institutional knowledge that made Blitzkrieg possible in 1940 no longer existed in December 1944. The Ardennes offensive was revealing that Germany could still assemble powerful forces but could no longer coordinate their employment effectively. At 5 p.m. on December 18th, disaster struck the stalled columns in the form of mechanical failure. A King Tiger tank, attempting to push a disabled American half-track off the road near Recht, overshot the narrow shoulder and slid into a ditch. The King Tiger, weighing 68 tons, sank deep into the soft ground beside the road. Its tracks spun uselessly, digging deeper. Recovery was impossible. Moving a 68-ton tank from a ditch required specialized equipment that was not available. The King Tiger now blocked the entire road. Every vehicle behind it was trapped. Officers considered blowing up the tank to clear the road, but the explosion would crater the road surface and create an even worse obstruction. Engineers discussed building a bypass, but the forest on either side was too dense and the ground too soft. For 16 hours, until engineers could construct a corduroy road of logs around the obstruction, the entire column was immobilized. The breakdown of a single vehicle paralyzed hundreds. It was a microcosm of the entire offensive, technically impressive equipment rendered useless by inadequate infrastructure and logistics. The human frustration building in those stalled columns was as significant as the tactical paralysis. German soldiers sat in their vehicles hour after hour, engines running to provide heat, fuel gauges dropping, knowing they should be fighting but unable to move. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, staring at the endless line of vehicles ahead, calculating how many kilometers they could have traveled in the time they had been sitting still. Infantry shivered in half-tracks, wondering why they had trained for mobile warfare only to spend the offensive sitting motionless in traffic. Officers radioed increasingly desperate situation reports to higher headquarters, trying to convey the impossibility of the traffic situation. The responses from headquarters were variations on the same theme: maintain the advance, reach your objectives, the offensive must succeed. These orders from commanders who had not seen the actual conditions on the ground only increased the frustration and demonstrated the disconnect between planning and reality. The 12th SS Panzer Division's experience exemplified the larger catastrophe. This division, one of Germany's most powerful armoured formations, had been held in reserve for the critical moment when it could exploit Kampfgruppe Peiper's breakthrough. On December 18th, with Peiper isolated at Stoumont and desperately needing reinforcement, the 12th SS Panzer Division received orders to advance and relieve him. The division began moving forward at 8 a.m. By 8 p.m., 12 hours later, they had advanced 5 kilometers. Their commander, standing on a ridge overlooking the traffic jam, could see Stavelot in the distance, the town Peiper had captured and then lost. Barely 7 kilometers away, but 7 kilometers might as well have been 700. The roads were blocked by immobile vehicles. There was no way forward, no way to deploy off the roads, no way to bring the division's combat power to bear. The 12th SS Panzer Division, sent to rescue Kampfgruppe Peiper, could not even reach the battle. The traffic paralysis had cascading effects throughout the German operational plan. Fuel convoys that were supposed to resupply Peiper's tanks sat trapped 15 kilometers behind the front. Ammunition trucks carrying artillery shells for the bombardments that would support the advance idled uselessly in the forest. Medical units that should have been treating wounded were stuck in traffic, unable to reach the casualty collection points. Engineer units with bridge-building equipment that could have helped Peiper cross the rivers never reached his position. Every element of the offensive depended on movement, and movement had stopped. The offensive had not been defeated by American combat power, though American resistance was significant. It had been strangled by its own logistics, suffocated by traffic jams, and killed by the fundamental impossibility of moving a 20th century mechanized army through a 19th century road network with inadequate fuel and degraded organizational capacity. On December 19th, the weather began to clear. For German forces, this was catastrophic. The low clouds that had shielded their movements for 3 days lifted, revealing brilliant blue skies. At Allied airfields across France and Belgium, fighter-bomber squadrons received their orders with grim satisfaction. Pilots had been grounded since the offensive began, frustrated at their inability to support ground forces. Now, they launched in massive waves. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, British Typhoons, each loaded with bombs, rockets, and ammunition for their cannons. They headed for the Ardennes, where aerial reconnaissance had identified the massive traffic jams on every road. What followed was a slaughter. German vehicles, trapped on narrow roads, with no room to maneuver and no place to hide, were systematically destroyed from the air. Fighter bombers attacked in relays, each wave hitting the stalled columns, then returning to rearm, while fresh squadrons continued the assault. In a single day, December 23rd, Allied aircraft flew over 15,000 sorties against German positions in the Ardennes. German losses exceeded 200 vehicles destroyed and countless more damaged. The contrast between Allied and German operational capabilities was starkest in the air. The Luftwaffe attempted to counter the Allied air attacks, but could muster only token resistance. German fighter squadrons were grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed on the ground by Allied bombing. When German aircraft did manage to take off, they were vastly outnumbered and outperformed by Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe flew approximately 1,500 sorties during the entire Battle of the Bulge. Allied air forces flew over 20,000 sorties in the final week of December alone. The mathematical disparity was crushing. German soldiers, on the ground, watching their vehicles burn under air attack, while seeing virtually no German aircraft, understood the war was lost, even if their leaders would not admit it. Air superiority, which Germany had enjoyed in the early war years, now belonged entirely to the Allies, and that superiority was being used with devastating effect against the stalled German columns. The traffic catastrophe revealed the fundamental delusion underlying the Ardennes offensive. Hitler and his planners had convinced themselves that will and aggression could overcome material disadvantages. The early days of the offensive seemed to confirm this belief. Surprise had been achieved, American lines had been broken, panzers were driving deep into enemy territory, but the traffic jams demonstrated that modern mechanized warfare required more than courage and tactics. It required fuel, it required adequate roads, it required effective traffic control, it required air cover, it required all the logistical and organizational capabilities that Germany no longer possessed. The Wehrmacht of December 1944 could still fight tactically at the company and battalion level with skill and determination, but it could no longer function operationally at the division and army level. The traffic jams were proof. Germany could assemble powerful forces but could not move them, could not supply them, could not coordinate their actions, and could not protect them from enemy air attack. These were not problems that could be solved by fighting harder or believing more fervently in victory. They were material problems that required resources Germany did not have and organizational capabilities it had lost. By December 20th, the traffic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Roads that should have been highways to the Meuse had become graveyards of burned-out vehicles. German engineers worked desperately to clear routes, but every cleared bottleneck simply allowed traffic to advance to the next bottleneck. American artillery, now zeroed in on the major roads, added to the chaos by intermittently shelling the stalled columns. The psychological impact on German soldiers was severe. They had been told they were launching the offensive that would split the Allies and turn the war around. Instead, they were sitting in traffic jams, being bombed from the air, watching their fuel supplies consumed by idling engines, and accomplishing nothing. Morale, initially high on the offensive's first day, collapsed as the reality of the situation became undeniable. Officers who tried to maintain discipline found their orders increasingly questioned by soldiers who understood the operation had failed. The death of Blitzkrieg was complete. The tactical doctrine that had brought Germany its greatest victories, rapid movement, concentration of force, exploitation of breakthrough, deep penetration into enemy rear areas, was no longer executable. Not because the doctrine was flawed, but because the material and organizational prerequisites for that doctrine no longer existed. Germany in December 1944 could not move armies quickly, could not protect them from air attack, could not supply them adequately, and could not coordinate their actions effectively. The traffic jams in the Ardennes were the visible manifestation of these deficiencies. Every immobilized tank, every burning truck, every frustrated commander staring at the endless line of vehicles represented the gap between what Nazi ideology believed was possible through willpower and what material reality made impossible. The offensive would continue for several more weeks, but after the traffic collapse of December 18th through 20th, it was an offensive in name only. German forces were no longer advancing toward objectives. They were simply trying to survive, to hold what little ground they had gained, and eventually to retreat back to their start lines before being completely destroyed. The roads of the Ardennes, designed centuries earlier for horse carts and foot traffic, had proven stronger than the most powerful army Germany could assemble. Medieval infrastructure had defeated modern mechanization, and in that defeat, the last hopes of Nazi Germany died in a traffic jam. December 19th, 8 a.m. Joachim Peiper stands in the centre of Gleize, a small Belgian village perched on a ridge above the Amblève River, and makes the decision that will define the final chapter of his military career. His Kampfgruppe is surrounded. American forces have retaken Stavelot, cutting the route back to German lines. Strong American positions block every approach to the remaining bridges over the Amblève. His fuel is nearly exhausted, ammunition is running low, and radio messages from 6th Panzer Army headquarters promise relief that Peiper knows will never arrive. He has two choices: attempt an immediate breakout on foot, abandoning all vehicles and heavy equipment, or consolidate his forces and defend until relief arrives, or the situation becomes completely hopeless. Peiper chooses defense. He orders his battalion commanders to establish defensive positions throughout Gleize and the neighbouring village of Trois-Ponts, to prepare every building as a fighting position and to position tanks as fixed gun emplacements. "We will hold this village," he tells his officers, "until we are relieved or we all die." It is a statement of defiance and determination, but also an acknowledgement that the offensive has failed and survival is now the only objective. The defensive position Peiper organised was formidable despite the desperate circumstances. Gleize sits on high ground with excellent fields of fire in all directions. The stone buildings of the village centre provide natural fortifications, their thick walls capable of stopping small arms fire and shrapnel. The chateau on the north edge of town, a substantial 3-storey structure, becomes the command post and main casualty collection point. Peiper's approximately 800 remaining soldiers, all veterans of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, begin transforming the village into a fortress. Windows are barricaded with furniture and sandbags. Basements are reinforced with timber to create bomb shelters. Fighting positions are dug at key intersections. Most importantly, the tanks, immobilized for lack of fuel, are positioned at critical points where their powerful guns can cover approach routes. 28 King Tigers, 47 Panthers and Panzer IVs, all stationary but with functioning main guns and machine guns, create a defensive network that no American force can approach casually. The King Tigers represented both Peiper's greatest defensive asset and the symbol of the operation's failure. These were the most powerful tanks in the world, each mounting an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres, protected by armour up to 180mm thick. That was proof against most Allied anti-tank weapons. A single King Tiger could dominate an entire sector of the battlefield. But these magnificent machines, which should have been driving toward the Meuse, were now immobile pillboxes. King Tiger No. 213, positioned at the eastern entrance to Gleize, had perhaps 10 main gun rounds remaining and no fuel. Its commander could see American positions through his optics but could not manoeuvre to engage targets from different angles. The tank that had been designed for mobile offensive warfare was now a fixed defensive position. The transformation from blitzkrieg to siege warfare was complete. On December 19th at 2 p.m, the 82nd Airborne Division began the encirclement of Gleize. These were elite American troops, paratroopers, with extensive combat experience, supported by tank destroyers and artillery. They approached the village cautiously, knowing from experience that surrounded German forces often fought with desperate intensity. American reconnaissance probes met immediate and devastating fire. The King Tigers, even stationary, were lethal. When American tank destroyers attempted to engage from standard combat ranges of 800 to 1,000 metres, the King Tigers' return fire destroyed several vehicles before the Americans could withdraw. The American commanders quickly realised that assaulting Gleize frontally would result in prohibitive casualties. Instead, they settled into siege tactics: surround the village, cut off any remaining supply routes, and use artillery and air power to gradually reduce the German defences. Inside Gleize, the siege conditions worsened daily. By December 20th, food supplies were critically low. German soldiers were eating American K-rations captured earlier in the offensive, supplemented by slaughtering cattle and pigs from local farms. Water was less of a problem. The village had wells that remained functional, but medical supplies were severely inadequate. In the chateau cellar, German medics treated approximately 170 wounded German soldiers and over 150 American prisoners who had been wounded during their capture or the subsequent fighting. The wounded from both sides lay on straw in the cold cellar, sharing the limited medical supplies. Morphine was running out, bandages were being washed and reused. Serious wounds that required surgical intervention were treated with field expedients that would have been unacceptable in proper medical facilities. The medics did their best, but men were dying from wounds that would have been survivable with adequate medical care. The American prisoners held in Gleize created a complex situation that would later figure prominently in assessments of Peiper's conduct. After the massacres at Honsfeld and Malmedy, American soldiers and international observers expected that any Americans captured by Kampfgruppe Peiper would be murdered. But the approximately 150 American POWs in Gleize were treated correctly, according to the Geneva Conventions. They were provided the same rations as German soldiers, which meant they were hungry but not starving. Wounded Americans received medical care from German medics, limited though it was. The Americans were not abused, tortured, or murdered. This treatment stood in stark contrast to the earlier massacres, creating a paradox that defied simple explanations. How could the same Kampfgruppe that murdered prisoners at multiple locations also treat prisoners correctly at Gleize? The answer seemed to be a combination of circumstances. Peiper's personal presence and control, the static defensive situation that removed time pressure, and perhaps a recognition that murdering prisoners while surrounded by enemies would guarantee no quarter if the position was overrun. On December 21st, at 3 p.m., American P-47 Thunderbolts attacked Gleize in waves. The fighter bombers came in low, strafing German positions with 50 caliber machine guns and dropping 500-pound bombs on suspected strongpoints. The attack was coordinated with artillery fire, creating a storm of explosives that pulverized buildings and set multiple structures ablaze. German soldiers took shelter in basements and foxholes, emerging after each wave to repair damaged positions. The attack destroyed 3 of Peiper's remaining operational Panthers, hit by bombs or rockets while positioned in the open. More critically, the air attack destroyed the last semblance of mobility. Several vehicles that still had small amounts of fuel were disabled by strafing runs. By the evening of December 21st, Kampfgruppe Peiper had 0 mobile vehicles. Everything was either destroyed or immobilized. The transformation from armored Kampfgruppe to static infantry force was complete. The radio communications between Peiper and higher headquarters during the siege revealed the growing desperation of the situation. Peiper sent repeated messages requesting relief, ammunition resupply, medical evacuation of wounded, and permission to break out. The responses from 6th Panzer Army headquarters were consistent. Hold position, relief forces are being organized, reinforcements are coming. But Peiper knew these promises were hollow. He could hear American radio traffic. He knew from prisoners that massive American forces were converging on his position. He understood that no German force could fight through the American encirclement to reach him. The orders to hold were based not on tactical reality, but on the political impossibility of admitting the offensive had failed. On the evening of December 22nd, Peiper received a final radio message that ended any hope of relief. Relief force cannot break through. You are on your own. The transmission was brief and matter-of-fact, but it confirmed what Peiper had known for days. There would be no rescue. Kampfgruppe Peiper would either break out on its own or be destroyed in place. The civilians of Gleize, trapped in their village during the battle, added another dimension of suffering to the siege. Approximately 500 Belgian residents remained in Gleize, sheltering in cellars while the battle raged above them. They shared the same risks as the soldiers: artillery fire, bombing, small arms fire that came through walls. Belgian civilians were killed by both German and American fire, caught in a battle they had not asked for and could not escape. Peiper's forces made some effort to protect civilians, designating certain cellars as civilian shelters and attempting to keep combat away from known civilian concentrations. But in a siege, such efforts had limited effect. By the time the battle ended, over 50 Belgian civilians had been killed in Gleize, their homes destroyed, their community devastated. They were casualties of a war that had come to their village without warning and would leave it in ruins. By December 22nd evening, Peiper's situation was mathematically hopeless. He commanded approximately 800 men, had ammunition for perhaps 1 or 2 more days of sustained combat, no fuel, inadequate medical supplies, and was surrounded by American forces that were growing stronger daily. His defensive perimeter was contracting as American pressure forced gradual withdrawal from outlying positions. The Americans had no need to assault frontally. They could simply tighten the noose and wait for German supplies to run out. Peiper called his final commanders' conference that evening in the chateau cellar, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard by the wounded lying nearby. He outlined the situation with brutal honesty. They could not hold longer than another day or two. Relief was not coming. They faced three options: surrender, fight to the death, or attempt a breakout. Surrender meant probable war crimes trials given the massacres earlier in the offensive. Fighting to the death was honourable but pointless, accomplishing nothing except adding to the casualty lists. That left breakout as the only viable option, desperate though it was. The fortress of Gleize, which had held for 4 days against overwhelming American pressure, was about to be abandoned. Peiper's decision to defend Gleize had been based on hope that relief would arrive. Now that hope was gone. The defensive stand had accomplished only delay, buying time that benefited no one since no other German forces could exploit that time. The siege had demonstrated that even elite SS troops with excellent equipment could not overcome the fundamental problems of inadequate supplies, overwhelming enemy strength, and total Allied air superiority. The King Tigers that should have been driving to the Meuse sat immobilized in Gleize, soon to be abandoned to the enemy. They had been built to destroy. The fortress that Peiper had declared they would hold until relieved or dead would instead be evacuated in a desperate nighttime breakout, leaving behind the wounded, the prisoners, and all the heavy equipment that had made Kampfgruppe Peiper one of the most powerful armoured formations in the Wehrmacht. The siege of Gleize was ending not with heroic last stands, but with the pragmatic decision to survive and fight another day. But that decision required abandoning everything that made the Kampfgruppe effective: the tanks, the vehicles, the heavy weapons, everything except the men and their small arms. What had begun as an elite armoured spearhead would end as exhausted infantry fleeing through frozen forests. The transformation was complete, and the symbolism was perfect. Germany's last great offensive had been reduced to this: soldiers on foot in the snow, abandoning the magnificent machines they had once commanded, retreating in darkness toward an uncertain fate. December 17th, 10 a.m. The Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles, General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters. Senior Allied commanders gather in emergency session, the atmosphere tense as staff officers brief the situation developing in the Ardennes. The German offensive has been underway for 28 hours, and reports flooding in from the front paint a picture that is simultaneously alarming and opportunistic. Eisenhower stands before a large wall map, studying the red arrows indicating German penetrations. His demeanour is calm but focused. General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, argues the attack is a spoiling attack, perhaps 5 or 6 divisions trying to disrupt Allied offensive plans. General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, disagrees, pointing to intercepts and prisoner reports suggesting this is something much larger. Eisenhower makes a decision that will define the Allied response. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. It is a remarkable statement that reframes the crisis as a chance to destroy German forces that have come out from behind their fortifications. The operational genius of Eisenhower's response was to recognize immediately what the German offensive made possible. For months, Allied forces had been grinding forward against prepared German defences, paying in blood for every kilometre gained. German forces fought from fortified positions, making maximum use of defensive terrain, then withdrew to new defensive lines when their positions became untenable. It was attritional warfare that favoured the defender, but now the Germans had voluntarily abandoned their fortifications and committed their reserves to a mobile offensive. They were exposed, moving on roads where they could be attacked from the air, extended on narrow salients where their flanks were vulnerable, operating far from their supply bases. If the Allies could contain the penetrations and then counterattack, they could destroy German forces in the open, rather than having to dig them out of prepared positions. The Ardennes offensive, if handled correctly, could become the decisive battle that broke German military power in the West. The immediate challenge was moving forces to contain the breakthrough before it could expand into a genuine strategic crisis. On December 18th at 3 a.m., one of the most remarkable logistical operations of the war began. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, received orders to disengage from his offensive toward the Saar, pivot his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and attack into the southern shoulder of the German penetration. This was not a minor adjustment, but a complete reorientation of an entire army. 3 divisions, over 50,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, all had to be extracted from one battle, moved up to 100 miles over winter roads, and inserted into a completely different battle. Standard military planning assumed such an operation would take weeks. Patton promised Eisenhower he could attack within 72 hours. It was an audacious promise, and Patton delivered. On December 22nd, exactly 72 hours after receiving the order, 3rd Army's 4th Armoured Division attacked north toward Bastogne. The movement of 3rd Army represented Allied logistical superiority at its most impressive. While German forces struggled to move along single roads through the Ardennes, American forces moved entire divisions hundreds of miles and inserted them into combat with minimal confusion. The key was the Allied logistics infrastructure that had been built over 6 months since the Normandy invasion. The supply network included functioning railways, thousands of trucks in organised motor transport battalions, fuel pipelines that delivered millions of gallons directly to forward areas, and most critically, a communications network that allowed coordinated movement of large formations. Staff officers at every level understood their roles and executed complex movements with professional competence. Traffic control was maintained by military police at every crossroads. Fuel and supplies were pre-positioned along routes to minimize delays. It was the kind of operational execution that required institutional competence built over years of experience. Germany no longer possessed this capability. The Allies demonstrated they had perfected it. Simultaneously with 3rd Army's movement, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, elite formations that had been resting in France after Operation Market Garden, received emergency deployment orders. On December 18th, these divisions moved by truck convoy 180 miles overnight to positions at Werbemont and Bastogne, respectively. They travelled through darkness on icy roads, arrived exhausted, and immediately went into defensive positions without time to reconnoitre their sectors or prepare fortifications. The 101st Airborne reached Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before German forces encircled the town. Their presence transformed what could have been a German walkover into a week-long siege that absorbed German combat power and bought time for American counterattacks to develop. It was another example of Allied flexibility and responsiveness that German forces could no longer match. On December 20, Eisenhower made his most controversial decision of the battle. He split command of American forces. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, was given temporary command of all American forces north of the German penetration, including the 9th and 1st Armies. Bradley retained command of forces south of the penetration. The decision was tactically sound. Montgomery's headquarters was better positioned to coordinate the northern response, and the German breakthrough had disrupted communications between Bradley's headquarters and his northern armies. But the decision created political tensions that nearly fractured the Allied coalition. Montgomery, never modest about his achievements, publicly suggested that British forces had rescued Americans from disaster. American commanders and soldiers, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, reacted with fury. Eisenhower had to personally intervene to smooth relations, reminding everyone that the alliance mattered more than national pride. The incident revealed that, even in crisis, coalition warfare remained as much about managing egos as managing battles. The weather break on December 23rd transformed the battle decisively in favour of the Allies. For a week, low clouds had grounded Allied air forces, neutralising the greatest Allied advantage. But on December 23rd, high pressure moved over Belgium, bringing crystal clear skies. Allied air forces launched the largest aerial operation of the European War. Over 5,000 aircraft took to the skies, heavy bombers attacking German supply lines and rail yards, medium bombers striking troop concentrations, fighter bombers hunting tanks and vehicles, fighters providing air superiority. German forces in the Ardennes experienced what their enemies on the eastern and western fronts had endured for months: unrelenting air attack with no possibility of respite. German soldiers gave the clear skies a bitter nickname: Jabbo Jagged Weather. Jabbo being short for jagged bomber, fighter bomber. When skies were clear, German forces could not move without being attacked from the air. The scale of Allied air operations dwarfed anything Germany could counter. Between December 23rd and December 26th, Allied air forces flew over 15,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and pilot losses, managed approximately 1,500 sorties during the same period. The 10-to-1 numerical disparity was decisive. German fighters that did take off were quickly overwhelmed by American P-51s and P-47s that had both numerical and qualitative superiority. German pilots, many of them undertrained replacements with minimal flying hours, stood no chance against Allied pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The few German aircraft that survived fighter interception were met by intensive anti-aircraft fire from American ground forces. By December 25th, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased operations over the Ardennes. The skies belonged entirely to the Allies, and they used that dominance to devastating effect. The fuel advantage the Allies enjoyed was perhaps the most fundamental difference between the two sides. While German tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel, Allied forces had effectively unlimited supplies. American trucks carrying 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline operated continuously, delivering fuel to forward positions. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that had supplied the advance across France, was reactivated specifically for the Ardennes battle. Fuel pipelines that extended from Normandy beachheads to the German border pumped thousands of gallons per hour. Allied forces never made tactical decisions based on fuel availability, because fuel was always available. This fundamental disparity meant that even when German forces achieved tactical successes, they could not exploit them because their tanks ran dry. Allied forces, by contrast, could maintain operational tempo indefinitely, moving reserves, shifting forces to threatened sectors, and conducting counterattacks without fuel constraints. It was the difference between an army that could still fight and an army that could no longer sustain operations. By December 26th, just 10 days after the offensive began, the strategic situation had reversed completely. German forces had achieved maximum penetration and were now being pushed back from all directions. American forces at Bastogne held out against siege, tying down German divisions that should have been exploiting the breakthrough. Patton's Third Army relieved Bastogne on December 26th, breaking the encirclement and establishing a secure supply line. In the north, American and British forces contained the German salient and prepared counterattacks to reduce it. Kampfgruppe Peiper was surrounded at Gleize, isolated and powerless. Other German spearheads had been stopped at various points, none having reached even halfway to the Meuse River. German casualties were mounting catastrophically, with estimates exceeding 20,000 killed and wounded in the first 10 days. Equipment losses were even worse. Over 400 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, losses Germany could not replace. The Allied response to the Ardennes offensive demonstrated institutional competence at every level of command. Strategic decision-making by Eisenhower reframed crisis as opportunity. Operational planning by army commanders moved massive forces rapidly and inserted them into combat effectively. Tactical execution by division and regimental commanders adapted to unexpected situations and fought with determination. Logistics sustained the entire effort, moving supplies and reinforcements where needed without the breakdowns that paralyzed German forces. Intelligence, though it had failed to predict the offensive, rapidly provided accurate assessments of German strength and intentions once the battle began. Communications allowed coordinated responses across hundreds of miles of front. It was the kind of comprehensive military effectiveness that Germany had once possessed but had lost through years of attrition, failed leadership, and material shortages. The closing of the trap around German forces in the Ardennes was methodical and inexorable. American and British forces did not attempt dramatic encirclements but simply compressed the German salient from all sides simultaneously. Each day, Allied forces advanced a few kilometers, reclaiming villages and forcing German withdrawals. German commanders requested permission to retreat to defensible positions, but Hitler refused, insisting every meter of ground be held. The result was that German forces remained in exposed positions where they could be systematically destroyed by artillery and air power. By early January, the bulge in Allied lines that had given the battle its name was being steadily erased. German forces that had driven 40 miles into Allied territory in the offensive's first days were being pushed back toward their start lines. The cost in German lives and equipment was staggering, losses that Germany could not afford, and that accelerated the Wehrmacht's final collapse. The response to the Ardennes offensive revealed the fundamental asymmetry between the Allied and German military situations in December 1944. The Allies had material superiority, unlimited fuel and supplies, air dominance, functioning logistics, competent command structures, and most critically, strategic depth that allowed them to absorb tactical defeats and respond with overwhelming force. Germany had tactical skill, brave soldiers, excellent equipment when it could be fueled, but lacked everything else. No amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome those fundamental disadvantages. The Ardennes offensive had been Germany's attempt to prove that will and aggression could triumph over material weakness. The Allied response demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare required more than will. It required fuel, supplies, air cover, functioning logistics, and the institutional competence to coordinate large forces. Germany no longer possessed these capabilities. The Allies had perfected them. The closing trap in the Ardennes was proof. By the end of December, the question was not whether the German offensive had failed, but only how many German soldiers would die or be captured before Hitler finally accepted reality and authorized a retreat. The opportunity Eisenhower had seen on December 17th was being realized. German forces had come out from their fortifications and were being systematically destroyed in the open. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as Germany's last offensive, but it would also be remembered as the battle where the Wehrmacht's destruction became inevitable and visible to everyone, including the German soldiers dying in the Ardennes snows. December 23rd, 3 p.m. The chateau at Gleize. Joachim Peiper gathers his remaining officers in the cellar, speaking in low tones to avoid disturbing the wounded men lying on straw around them. The situation is no longer sustainable. American forces have tightened the encirclement to the point where German positions are being compressed into a few hundred meters of the village centre. Artillery falls continuously on Gleize, methodically destroying every building. Ammunition is nearly exhausted. Tank commanders report having 5 to 10 main gun rounds remaining, barely enough for one more engagement. Food supplies are down to perhaps 2 days of half rations. Most critically, the radio message from higher headquarters has confirmed what everyone already knew. No relief is coming. Peiper outlines his decision with characteristic directness. We will abandon everything and fight our way out on foot tonight. Take only weapons, 1 blanket per man, no personal items. We march in single file through the forests to reach German lines. Anyone who cannot keep up will be left behind. It is a brutal calculus of survival, the final admission that the offensive has failed completely. The planning for the breakout consumed the remainder of the afternoon. German officers studied maps of the terrain between Gleize and the nearest German positions near Warn, approximately 18 kilometers to the southeast. The route would cross the Sambre River at a ford near Petit Spy, then traverse dense forests where American forces were presumably positioned but hopefully not in great strength. The operation would begin at 11:30 p.m., using darkness to mask the movement. The column would march in single file to minimize noise and avoid detection. No vehicles would accompany the breakout. Everything mechanical would be abandoned. Speed was essential. The column needed to cross the Sambre River and reach the cover of the forests before dawn, when American observation aircraft would spot them. It was a plan based more on desperation than tactical sophistication, but it was the only option remaining. Surrender would mean war crimes, trials, and probable execution. Staying meant certain death or capture within days. The breakout at least offered a chance. At 6 p.m., German medics began the grim task of preparing the wounded for abandonment. All German wounded who could walk were told they would march with the column, though many would not survive the 18-kilometer trek through frozen forests. All American wounded prisoners and all German wounded too seriously injured to walk would be left behind in the chateau. Medics moved the most seriously wounded into the main hall of the chateau, a large room with a fireplace where they could at least be kept warm. They laid out all remaining medical supplies: morphine, bandages, sulfur powder, what little they had left. A German medical officer composed a note in English explaining the situation and asking that American forces care for the wounded. The note was placed prominently on a table near the entrance. It was an acknowledgement that the men being left behind were being entrusted to enemy mercy, a mercy that SS troops had not shown to American prisoners at Malmedy and Honsfeld. Whether the Americans would reciprocate or exact revenge was unknowable. The decision about what to do with the American prisoners who were not wounded created another moral dilemma. Approximately 150 American POWs were held in Gleize, most of them uninjured or only lightly wounded. Taking them on the breakout was impossible. They could not be controlled in darkness over rough terrain, and they would slow the column fatally. Executing them was the SS solution that had been applied at Malmedy, and some officers suggested it, but Peiper refused. Whether this refusal reflected moral principle, tactical calculation that murdering prisoners before a breakout would ensure no quarter if captured, or simply recognition that such an atrocity would be witnessed by too many German soldiers and could not be concealed, remains debated. The American prisoners would be left in Gleize, unharmed, to be liberated by American forces. It was the correct decision under military law, though it stood in stark contrast to earlier massacres. The contradiction was never satisfactorily explained. At 11:30 p.m. on December 23, the breakout began. 800 SS troops filed silently out of Gleize, moving south in single column through darkness and falling snow. They carried rifles, one blanket each, and minimal supplies. Behind them, they left everything that had made Kampfgruppe Peiper a formidable military formation. 28 King Tigers, 47 Panthers and Panzer IVs, over 500 other vehicles, all artillery, all heavy weapons, all the wounded who could not walk, and all the American prisoners. German engineers had placed demolition charges on the tanks, intending to destroy them to prevent American use. But the charges, poorly prepared in the rush or sabotaged by demoralized soldiers, would largely fail to detonate. The Americans would capture the abandoned equipment intact, providing invaluable intelligence about German tank design and a propaganda windfall of photographs showing Germany's most powerful tanks abandoned and defeated. The march through the forests was a test of endurance that many did not survive. The temperature was well below freezing. Snow covered the ground, making footing treacherous. The forest trails were barely visible in darkness. Men marched in silence, each following the man ahead, hoping the lead elements knew where they were going. Soldiers who stumbled and fell struggled to get up before the column left them behind. The wounded, attempting to keep pace despite their injuries, fell behind in increasing numbers. Peiper had been explicit. The column would not stop for stragglers. Within the first hour, dozens of men were strung out behind the main column, struggling through the snow alone, knowing that falling too far behind meant capture or death from exposure. It was the Eastern Front experience replayed in Belgium. Exhausted soldiers, trudging through frozen darkness, hoping to survive until dawn. At 2 a.m. on December 24th, the lead elements of Peiper's column reached the Somme River at the Petit Spy Ford. The river was not frozen, but was shallow enough to wade if one was willing to endure the shock of ice-cold water. The first soldiers entered the river hesitantly, the water rising to waist depth, the cold so intense it caused involuntary gasping. They pushed across, scrambled up the far bank, and established security while the rest of the column crossed. 800 men crossing a river in darkness is not a quick operation. For nearly 2 hours, the column filed through the water, each man enduring the numbing cold, emerging on the far side, shivering violently, wet uniforms beginning to freeze in the December air. Several men, weakened by wounds or exhaustion, were swept away by the current and drowned. Others collapsed on the far bank from hypothermia and could not be revived. The Somme River crossing cost Peiper approximately 30 men, but the column was now in territory where German forces were operating with a realistic chance of reaching friendly lines. American forces, remarkably, did not detect the breakout until it was too late to intercept effectively. Sentries at observation posts near Trois-Ponts reported hearing movement in the forests around 2 a.m., but assumed it was animal activity or perhaps small German patrols. No one anticipated that an entire Kampfgruppe would abandon all equipment and flee on foot through the forests. By the time American commanders understood what was happening, Peiper's column had crossed the Somme and was deep into the forests. American units attempted to organize pursuit, but tracking 800 men through dense forest in darkness was nearly impossible. Artillery fire was called down on suspected crossing points, but by then the Germans had moved on. The pursuit was half-hearted. American commanders were satisfied that Kampfgruppe Peiper had been destroyed as a combat force. Whether the individual soldiers escaped or were captured mattered less than the fact that the unit no longer existed as a threat. By 6 a.m. on December 24, as dawn broke over the Ardennes, the lead elements of Peiper's column stumbled into German positions near One. They were exhausted, soaked, frozen, many suffering from frostbite and hypothermia, but they were alive and had reached German lines. Throughout the morning, the remainder of the column arrived in small groups, soldiers emerging from the forests in twos and threes, barely able to stand. A final count on Christmas Day revealed that Approximately 770 men had reached German lines, 30 had drowned crossing the Sambre River or died from exposure during the march. The remainder, perhaps 100 men, had been captured by American forces or had simply disappeared in the forests. Of the original 4,800 men of Kampfgruppe Peiper that had crossed the start line on December 16th, only 770 remained. The rest were dead, wounded, and captured or missing. The unit had ceased to exist as a military formation. On December 24 at 2 p.m., American forces entered La Gleize cautiously, expecting booby traps and perhaps a last-stand defense. Instead, they found the village abandoned except for the wounded in the chateau. German wounded and American prisoners lay together in the main hall, tended by a single German medic who had volunteered to stay behind. The medic surrendered immediately, explaining in broken English that Peiper had ordered all wounded cared for, regardless of nationality. American medics quickly assessed the situation and began treating the wounded, many of whom were in critical condition after days without adequate medical care. The American prisoners, weak from their ordeal but alive, were evacuated to rear areas. The German wounded were also treated and evacuated, though they would eventually face war crimes investigations for their unit's actions during the offensive. Outside the chateau, American officers walked through streets littered with abandoned German equipment. The sight was extraordinary. King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world, sat undamaged along the roads, their guns pointing uselessly at nothing, their fuel tanks empty. Panthers that had terrorized Allied armor for years now sat silent and defeated. Self-propelled guns, half-tracks, trucks, all abandoned intact. Engineers examined the demolition charges placed on the tanks and found most had failed to detonate, whether due to faulty preparation or deliberate sabotage. One King Tiger, number 213, was selected for special study. It would eventually be shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in the United States, where American engineers would examine every aspect of its design, providing intelligence that would influence American tank development for years. The propaganda value of the abandoned equipment was immediately recognized by Allied public relations officers. Photographers documented the scene extensively. Images of intact King Tigers, abandoned by their crews, appeared in newspapers across the Allied world. The narrative was clear. Germany's most powerful weapons had been defeated not primarily by Allied combat power, but by fuel shortages, logistical failures, and operational incompetence. The photographs told a story of German military collapse more effectively than any written report. These were not tanks destroyed in heroic combat, but tanks abandoned because they could not be supplied. It was a humiliating end for equipment that represented the peak of German armoured technology and for the elite SS unit that had operated them. The breakout from La Gleize marked the end of Kampfgruppe Peiper as a military formation, but not the end of its historical significance. The unit that had been Germany's spearhead, that had driven deeper into Allied lines than any other formation, that had come within kilometres of potentially decisive river crossings, had been destroyed without achieving its objectives. More significantly, the unit's legacy would be defined not by its tactical achievements, but by its war crimes. The massacres at Honsfeld, Malmedy, and multiple other locations ensured that Kampfgruppe Peiper would be remembered as a criminal formation whose military successes were overshadowed by atrocities. Peiper's decision to treat prisoners correctly at La Gleize would not erase the earlier murders. If anything, it highlighted the arbitrary nature of the violence. Some Americans were treated correctly, others were murdered, with no clear pattern to explain the difference. For Joachim Peiper personally, the breakout represented survival but not vindication. He had led 770 men out of encirclement, a remarkable tactical achievement under desperate circumstances. But he had lost over 80% of his command, abandoned all heavy equipment, and failed to achieve any strategic objectives. The offensive he was supposed to spearhead had collapsed. The route to the Meuse that should have taken 48 hours had instead taken 8 days and ended in retreat. His reputation as an aggressive and capable commander would be permanently stained by the war crimes committed under his command. Whether he directly ordered the massacres or simply created the conditions that made them likely would be debated in courts and history books for decades. But command responsibility was clear. Peiper commanded the unit, war crimes occurred, and he bore ultimate accountability. On Christmas Day, December 25th, Peiper reported to 6th Panzer Army headquarters with the survivors of his Kampfgruppe. He was received coldly by staff officers who understood that the failure of Kampfgruppe Peiper represented the failure of the entire northern thrust of the offensive. Peiper submitted a formal report outlining the operation, initial successes, fuel shortages, bridge demolitions, encirclement, and finally the breakout. The report was factual and professional, but it could not disguise the fundamental failure. Kampfgruppe Peiper had been given the most critical mission of the offensive, had been provided the best equipment and most experienced troops, and had failed completely. The 770 exhausted survivors standing in the snow represented the remnants of what had been Germany's last hope for operational success in the West. The Christmas symbolism was bitter. While Allied soldiers celebrated with hot food and relative safety, the survivors of Kampfgruppe Peiper stood in formation, being told they had fought well but had not won. It was the epitaph for the entire Ardennes offensive, courageous, tactical performance that could not overcome strategic impossibilities. The breakout from Gleize was over, but the reckoning for what Kampfgruppe Peiper had done during its 8 days of operation was just beginning. December 26, 3 p.m, near Bastogne, Belgium, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 4th Armoured Division breaks through German encirclement and makes contact with the 101st Airborne Division defenders inside the town. The meeting is marked by handshakes, exhausted smiles, and the shared relief of soldiers who have survived a desperate siege. Bastogne had been surrounded for 7 days, its defenders holding out against overwhelming German pressure, supplied only by airdrops when weather permitted. The relief of Bastogne is both a tactical success and a symbolic turning point. It demonstrates that American forces can not only contain German advances but can counterattack effectively and restore their lines. More fundamentally, it marks the moment when the Ardennes offensive transitions from German attack to German retreat. The initiative has permanently shifted to the Allies. What follows will not be continued German advances, but rather a fighting withdrawal back to the start lines, consuming German lives and equipment for no strategic gain. The decision to defend Bastogne rather than evacuate had been controversial when made on December 19th. The town sat at a critical road junction where 7 roads converged, making it strategically valuable but also potentially a trap for defenders. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne, had famously responded "nuts" to German surrender demands on December 22nd, a reply that became legendary for its defiant brevity. But behind the bravado was serious concern. The defenders were short on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. German forces surrounded them with superior numbers and were conducting methodical attacks to reduce the perimeter. If Patton's Third Army had not broken through when it did, Bastogne might have fallen, handing Germany a significant tactical victory. The relief came just in time, transforming a potential disaster into an American triumph that would feature prominently in post-war narratives of the battle. On December 27, Field Marshal Walter Model recommended to Hitler that German forces withdraw to their start lines. Model's assessment was based on brutal tactical reality. The offensive had achieved maximum penetration and was now being compressed from all sides. German casualties exceeded 20,000 killed and wounded. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Over 400 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Thousands of vehicles lost. Artillery pieces captured or destroyed for lack of fuel to tow them. The fuel situation was hopeless. German forces were literally running dry, with tanks abandoned along roads when they exhausted their final litres of gasoline. American reinforcements were arriving faster than German forces could be resupplied. Allied air power, operating under clear skies, was destroying German columns with impunity. Every tactical indicator suggested immediate withdrawal was the only rational option. Model's recommendation was delivered to Hitler with supporting data and professional military assessment. Hitler's response was predictable and disastrous. Fight for every metre of ground, no withdrawal without explicit permission, the offensive must continue. Hitler's refusal to authorise timely withdrawal transformed the Ardennes offensive from a failed operation into a catastrophic defeat. German forces that could have retreated to defensible positions in relatively good order were instead forced to hold exposed salients where they could be systematically destroyed. The fighting between December 27 and January 8 was some of the most brutal of the entire battle, German units conducting desperate defensive actions against overwhelming Allied pressure, losing men and equipment for ground that would inevitably be abandoned anyway. It was the Stalingrad pattern repeated on a smaller scale. Hitler's refusal to permit tactical withdrawals, ensuring that defeats became disasters. German commanders understood what was happening but were powerless to prevent it. Orders were orders, and in the SS especially, questioning orders meant being relieved of command or worse. On January 3rd, 1945, American and British forces launched coordinated counteroffensives from north and south simultaneously. The First Army attacked from the north, driving south toward Houffalize. The Third Army attacked from the south, driving north toward the same objective. The pincer movement was designed to cut off German forces, still holding the deepest penetrations of the bulge. German resistance was fierce but increasingly futile. Units fought with determination born of desperation, knowing that survival depended on reaching German lines before being encircled. But Allied material superiority was overwhelming. American artillery fired missions continuously. German counter-battery fire was minimal because German guns lacked ammunition. Allied tanks advanced with infantry support. German anti-tank weapons were effective but increasingly scarce. The battle became a slow-motion collapse. German lines contracting daily as Allied pressure mounted from all directions. The American advance reclaimed ground in 48 hours that German forces had taken 12 days to capture. The contrast illustrated the fundamental asymmetry of the operational situation. The German offensive had been conducted with limited fuel, against stiffening resistance, through difficult terrain, with minimal air cover, and with inadequate logistics. The Allied counteroffensive was conducted with unlimited fuel, with total air superiority, with overwhelming material advantage, and with functioning logistics that kept frontline units supplied continuously. The speed differential was not primarily about courage or tactical skill, but about logistical capacity and material resources. Allied forces simply had everything they needed to sustain operations, while German forces had nothing. The result was predetermined by these material factors more than by battlefield decisions. On January 8th, Hitler finally authorized withdrawal of German forces from the Ardennes salient. The order came 2 weeks too late to save significant forces. By the time the withdrawal was authorized, German casualties had escalated to over 67,000 killed and wounded, with an additional 30,000 captured. These were losses Germany could not replace. The captured soldiers were particularly damaging. They represented trained, experienced troops who would have been valuable defending the Rhine or the Eastern Front. Instead, they would spend the remainder of the war in Allied prison camps. The equipment losses were equally irreplaceable. Germany's tank production, despite heroic efforts by industry and slave labour, could not compensate for the 800-plus tanks lost in the Ardennes. Each lost Panther or King Tiger was gone forever, while Allied factories continued producing Shermans and other vehicles at rates that dwarfed German production. By January 16th, American forces reached the original German start positions. The entire Ardennes bulge had been eliminated. The front line in mid-January 1945 was essentially identical to the front line in mid-December 1944. 6 weeks of brutal combat, over 100,000 casualties on both sides, thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed, and the strategic situation was unchanged. For Germany, this was catastrophic. The offensive had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves, the forces that should have been defending against the Soviet winter offensive that would begin on January 12th. For the Allies, the battle was costly but not strategically significant. American and British casualties were serious but replaceable. Lost equipment was replaced within weeks from the vast production base that supplied Allied forces. The battle had delayed Allied offensive plans by perhaps 6 weeks, but those plans would resume in February with unstoppable momentum. The final accounting of the Battle of the Bulge revealed the scale of German defeat. German casualties totaled approximately 100,000, 67,000 killed or wounded, 30,000 captured, the remainder missing. American casualties totaled approximately 89,000, 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. The casualty numbers were roughly comparable, but the strategic impact was vastly different. America could replace 90,000 casualties within months. Germany could not replace 100,000. The loss of trained, experienced soldiers accelerated the Wehrmacht's collapse. Divisions that had been bled white in the Ardennes were sent to defend the Rhine with inadequate strength. When American forces crossed the Rhine in March, they faced German units that were shadows of their former strength. The equipment losses were even more strategically significant than the casualties. Germany lost over 800 tanks and assault guns in the Ardennes, approximately 40% of the armour available on the Western Front in December 1944. These losses could not be replaced. German tank production in January 1945 was approximately 300 vehicles, less than half the Ardennes losses. Moreover, the lost tanks had been crewed by experienced men. Replacement crews were increasingly undertrained conscripts with minimal gunnery practice due to fuel shortages. The panzer divisions that limped out of the Ardennes in January were broken formations that would never recover their combat effectiveness. When the final Allied offensives began in February and March, German armoured reserves were inadequate to respond effectively. The Ardennes had consumed the last mechanized striking power of the Wehrmacht. The impact on the Eastern Front was perhaps the most significant strategic consequence. The Soviet winter offensive, beginning January 12, 1945, hit German defences that had been stripped of reserves to support the Ardennes. Entire divisions that should have been defending Poland and East Prussia were instead destroyed or captured in Belgium. German forces in the east, already outnumbered and outgunned, now faced Soviet armies with virtually no operational reserves. The Soviet advance was catastrophic. Warsaw fell on January 17th. East Prussia was cut off. German forces were pushed back hundreds of kilometres in weeks. The question of whether Germany could have delayed Soviet advances if the Ardennes reserves had been available in the east is unanswerable but worth considering. The offensive in the west accelerated defeat in the east, ensuring that Germany would be crushed from both directions simultaneously, with no possibility of stabilising either front. For the Belgian and Luxembourg civilians caught in the battle zone, the cost was measured in destroyed homes, lost lives, and shattered communities. Over 3,000 civilians were killed during the 6 weeks of fighting, caught between artillery barrages, bombed by aircraft, executed by retreating forces, or simply in the wrong place when combat erupted. Approximately 60,000 civilians were displaced, their homes destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Entire villages were levelled by artillery fire or burned during combat. The post-war reconstruction would take years and require massive international aid. The psychological scars would last a generation. Communities that had already endured 4 years of German occupation now suffered again as the front lines rolled over them a second time. The liberation that finally came in January 1945 was bittersweet. Freedom had been won, but at a terrible price in lives and destruction. The collapse of the Ardennes offensive marked the end of Germany's ability to conduct strategic operations. After January 1945, German forces fought only defensive battles, conducting local counterattacks when possible, but never again mounting anything approaching a theatre-level offensive. The resources did not exist, the trained personnel were gone, the fuel was unavailable, and most fundamentally, the organisational capacity to plan and execute complex operations had been destroyed. What remained was a German military that could still fight fiercely at the tactical level, making Allied advances costly but could not prevent those advances or alter the trajectory of the war. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but only how long the final agony would last and how many more would die before the inevitable end. As January turned to February and Allied forces prepared to resume their advance toward the Rhine, the memory of the Ardennes offensive was already being shaped into narratives that would persist for decades. For Americans, it would become the Battle of the Bulge, a story of initial surprise and hardship overcome by determination and eventual triumph, featuring heroes like McAuliffe at Bastogne and emphasizing American resilience. For Germans, it would become the last offensive, a story told with pride about soldiers who fought bravely in hopeless circumstances, conveniently omitting the atrocities and emphasizing tactical skill over strategic futility. For the Belgians, it would become the second liberation, a story of suffering endured and freedom restored. Each narrative contained truth, but was incomplete. The full truth was more complex. A desperate German offensive based on unrealistic planning, brutal combat fought by exhausted soldiers on both sides, war crimes that stained German tactical successes, and ultimately a defeat that accelerated Germany's collapse while demonstrating Allied material superiority and operational competence. The offensive that was supposed to change the course of the war instead confirmed its inevitable outcome. And in the ruins of Gleize, where abandoned King Tigers sat as monuments to German defeat, the material evidence of that failure would remain for historians and tourists to contemplate in the decades to come. May 16th, 1946, Dachau, Germany. A military courtroom has been established in the former concentration camp, a location chosen with deliberate symbolism. 73 defendants, all members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, sit in rows facing an American military tribunal. They wear German uniforms stripped of insignia, their faces showing the strain of months in custody and the weight of charges that could result in death sentences. Joachim Peiper sits in the front row, 31 years old, his bearing still military despite his circumstances. He is the senior defendant, the commander responsible for the unit's actions, and the man whose name has become synonymous with the massacre at Malmedy. The charges are read with formal precision: murder of 362 American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians at multiple locations during December 1944. The prosecution will argue this was systematic criminality directed or tolerated by command. The defence will argue these were isolated acts by individual soldiers, war crimes, but not command-ordered policy. The trial that follows will become one of the most controversial war crimes proceedings of the post-war era. The prosecution's case was built on three foundations: survivor testimony, physical evidence, and the pattern of killings across multiple locations. American survivors of the Malmedy massacre testified with devastating clarity. They described being assembled after surrender, machine-gunned while their hands were raised, systematically executed as they lay wounded in the snow. Their accounts were consistent across dozens of witnesses. Belgian civilians corroborated the testimony, describing what they had witnessed from houses overlooking the killing field. The physical evidence supported the witnesses: bodies with bullet wounds to the head indicating execution rather than combat casualties, photographs taken by Belgian civilians showing the scene before snow obscured the evidence, and forensic examinations confirming the manner of death. Most damning was the pattern: killings at Honsfeld on December 17th, Malmedy on December 17th, Ligneuville on December 17th, Stavelot on December 18th, and multiple other locations through December 21st. The prosecution argued that multiple massacres across 5 days demonstrated systematic criminality that could only have been policy or, at minimum, was tolerated by commanders. Peiper's testimony, delivered on July 3rd, was careful and legalistic. He denied ordering the killing of prisoners at any location. He claimed to have no knowledge of the Malmedy massacre until after the war. He acknowledged that his orders emphasized speed and aggression, but insisted he never authorized violations of the Geneva Conventions. When confronted with evidence that massacres occurred at multiple locations under his command, Peiper argued that individual soldiers made criminal decisions without his knowledge or approval. His defense team emphasized that hundreds of American prisoners had been processed correctly, pointing to the 150 Americans left alive at Gleize as evidence that Peiper enforced military law when he had control. The argument was that bad soldiers committed crimes, not that commanders ordered crimes. It was a distinction that prosecutors found disingenuous given the pattern of killings and the command climate Peiper had created. The trial's most dramatic moment came when prosecution introduced testimony about interrogation methods used to obtain confessions from defendants. Defense attorneys alleged that American investigators had used physical abuse, mock trials, threats against families, and psychological torture to extract confessions from German prisoners. Several defendants testified they had been kept in solitary confinement, denied sleep, subjected to mock executions with hoods and fake nooses, and told that confessing was their only chance to avoid immediate execution. The allegations were serious enough that the trial was temporarily suspended while investigators examined the interrogation procedures. The resulting investigation found that some interrogation techniques had been improper, including psychological pressure that bordered on coercion, though outright physical torture was not conclusively proven. The findings damaged the prosecution's case and provided grounds for appeals that would continue for years. On July 16th, all 73 defendants were found guilty. 43 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Joachim Peiper. 22 received life imprisonment. 8 received shorter prison terms. The verdicts were based on command responsibility doctrine. Commanders are responsible for crimes committed by subordinates if they ordered the crimes, knew about them and failed to stop them, or should have known about them given the circumstances. Peiper was held accountable not because prosecutors could prove he personally shot prisoners, but because he commanded the unit, created the operational tempo that pressured subordinates to eliminate prisoners quickly, and failed to prevent a pattern of killings that he should have anticipated given SS training and Eastern Front experience. It was a legal theory of command responsibility that would become foundational in international war crimes law, but was still evolving in 1946. The appeals process that followed was influenced as much by Cold War politics as by legal arguments. By 1948, American and Soviet relations had deteriorated into open confrontation. Western leaders concluded that German rearmament was necessary to counter Soviet power in Europe. But rearming Germany while executing German officers for war crimes created political complications. German public opinion, which might have accepted war crimes convictions in 1946, became increasingly sympathetic to the defendants as Cold War tensions mounted. The narrative shifted from SS war criminals to German soldiers who fought bravely but made mistakes in the chaos of combat. American politicians, sensitive to the need for German cooperation, began questioning whether the convictions had been just or whether they had been influenced by post-war revenge sentiment. The result was systematic review of all death sentences from the Malmedy trial. In 1949, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee conducted investigations into allegations of improper interrogation techniques. The committee, chaired by Senator Raymond Baldwin, heard testimony from defendants and investigators. The findings were mixed. Some interrogation techniques were found to be improper, but not sufficient to invalidate the convictions. The committee recommended clemency review for all defendants, a recommendation that effectively ensured no executions would be carried out. The review process was exhaustive and influenced by political considerations as much as legal ones. By 1951, Cold War priorities had shifted decisively. The Korean War had begun, requiring American focus on containing communism rather than prosecuting decade-old war crimes. German reintegration into Western defense structures was proceeding, and holding SS officers in prison was diplomatically awkward. All 43 death sentences were commuted to prison terms. Joachim Peiper was released from Landsberg prison on December 22, 1956, having served 10 years of his life sentence. The early release was controversial but reflected the broader pattern of reduced sentences for war criminals as Cold War politics overtook justice considerations. Peiper moved to France under an assumed name, working as a translator and living quietly. He avoided publicity and refused most interviews about his wartime service. His presence in France was known to some locals but tolerated until the mid-1970s, when his true identity became widely publicized. On July 13, 1976, Peiper's house was firebombed by unknown assailants, likely French resistance veterans or relatives of victims of SS atrocities. Peiper died in the fire. He was 61 years old. His death was investigated as murder, but no arrests were ever made. It was a violent end for a man whose life had been marked by violence, a death that perhaps reflected the delayed justice that the legal system had failed to deliver. The controversy surrounding the Malmedy trial extended far beyond Peiper's death. Historians and legal scholars continue to debate whether the trial was just or flawed. Defenders of the convictions point to the overwhelming evidence of systematic prisoner killings, the multiple locations and dates of massacres, and the command responsibility doctrine that makes commanders accountable for subordinate actions. Critics point to the interrogation irregularities, the use of potentially coerced confessions, and questions about whether individual soldiers' crimes can always be attributed to command-level decisions. The debate reflects larger questions about war crimes, prosecution, what standard of proof is required, how much command responsibility extends down to individual criminal acts, and whether justice delayed becomes justice denied when political considerations overtake legal processes. The impact of the Malmedy trial on international law was significant despite its controversies. The trial helped establish command responsibility as a recognized principle in war crimes law. Commanders cannot simply claim ignorance of subordinate crimes if a pattern of criminality exists that they should have detected and stopped. This principle was codified in later war crimes statutes and international humanitarian law. The trial also demonstrated the difficulties of prosecuting war crimes in the immediate aftermath of conflict. When emotions run high, evidence is fresh but potentially contaminated by improper procedures, and the line between justice and revenge is difficult to maintain. These lessons influenced how later war crimes tribunals were structured, with greater emphasis on procedural safeguards and international rather than purely national jurisdiction. For the survivors of the Malmedy massacre and families of the murdered soldiers, the trial's outcome was deeply unsatisfying. They had testified, relived their trauma, and watched all 73 defendants convicted and 43 sentenced to death. But not a single execution was carried out. The men who had murdered their comrades and relatives eventually walked free, many after serving only a fraction of their sentences. The commutations sent a message that seemed to contradict the trial's purpose, that war crimes prosecution was subject to political expediency. that Cold War considerations mattered more than justice for victims, and that German officers could commit atrocities and eventually return to normal life with minimal consequences. This perception, whether fair or not, undermined confidence in war crimes justice and created cynicism about whether international law could ever truly hold powerful actors accountable. The Malmedy trial also became entangled in post-war German memory politics. Some German veterans organizations portrayed the defendants as honorable soldiers, unjustly persecuted by victors' justice, conveniently omitting the atrocities and emphasizing procedural flaws in the trial. This narrative fed into the larger clean Wehrmacht myth that attempted to separate the German military's tactical competence from its systematic criminality. Historians have thoroughly debunked this myth, demonstrating that Wehrmacht and especially Waffen-SS units were deeply complicit in war crimes throughout the war. But the myth persists in some circles, and the Malmedy trial's controversies provided ammunition for those seeking to rehabilitate the reputation of units like Kampfgruppe Peiper. The result is ongoing historical debates that mix legal analysis with ideological battles over how World War II should be remembered and whether German military service can be honoured separate from the crimes committed by German military units. The legal precedents established at the Malmedy trial have influenced every subsequent war crimes tribunal. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia explicitly cited Malmedy in establishing command responsibility for prison camp atrocities. The International Criminal Court's Rome Statute incorporates principles of command responsibility that trace back to cases like Malmedy. The trial demonstrated both the necessity and the difficulty of holding military commanders accountable for subordinate crimes. It showed that justice requires both substantive evidence and procedural fairness, that convictions obtained through improper means are vulnerable to political reversal, and that war crimes prosecution must be conducted with scrupulous attention to legal standards or risk becoming indistinguishable from revenge. These are lessons that remain relevant in contemporary conflicts where atrocities occur and questions of accountability arise. As the decades passed and the last survivors of the Malmedy massacre died, the trial became history rather than living memory. The courtroom at Dachau was dismantled, the defendants who served prison time were released, and mostly lived quietly until their deaths. The controversy shifted from questions of guilt or innocence to questions of historical interpretation. Was the trial justice or vengeance? Were the sentences appropriate or excessive? And what lessons should be drawn for future war crimes, prosecutions? These questions admit no simple answers. The Malmedy trial was simultaneously a legitimate effort to hold war criminals accountable and a proceeding marred by procedural flaws that undermined its legitimacy. It was justice delayed by Cold War politics, but also justice that at least attempted to address undeniable atrocities. The trial stands as a reminder that prosecuting war crimes is necessary for international order, but fraught with practical, legal, and political complications that no amount of moral clarity can fully resolve. And at the center of it all remained the 84 American soldiers who died in a field near Malmedy, murdered after they surrendered, whose deaths demanded justice that the legal system could only imperfectly provide. July 13th, 1976, Treves, France. Joachim Peiper's house burns through the night, flames visible for kilometers across the rural landscape. Local fire brigades arrive too late to save the structure or its occupant. In the smoldering ruins, investigators find Peiper's charred body, killed either by smoke inhalation or by the flames themselves. He was 61 years old, living under an assumed name, working as a translator, attempting to fade into post-war anonymity. His death by fire was grimly appropriate for a man whose nickname had been Blowtorch and whose unit had been accused of burning civilians during the war. French authorities investigated the death as murder, suspecting revenge by resistance veterans or relatives of victims, but no arrests were ever made. Peiper's death removed from the world a man who embodied the contradictions of the Wehrmacht, tactically brilliant, personally courageous, and complicit in systematic atrocities. His legacy would be debated for decades, becoming a focal point for larger arguments about how history should remember those who fought skillfully for evil causes. The 1980s saw the beginning of systematic efforts by German veterans organizations to rehabilitate the reputation of the Waffen-SS in general and Joachim Peiper specifically. Books and memoirs were published portraying Peiper as a brave soldier caught in circumstances beyond his control, emphasizing his tactical achievements while minimizing or omitting the massacres. These publications contributed to what historians call the clean Wehrmacht myth, the false narrative that the regular German military fought honorably while only the Nazi Party and its organizations committed atrocities. The myth was politically convenient for West Germany, allowing the country to honor its war dead and rehabilitate veterans while distancing itself from Nazi crimes. But it was historically false. Wehrmacht units, and especially Waffen-SS formations, were deeply complicit in war crimes throughout the war. The Eastern Front in particular had been a war of annihilation, where German forces systematically murdered civilians, executed prisoners, and implemented genocidal policies. Kampfgruppe Peiper's actions in Belgium were not aberrations, but reflections of a culture of brutality that permeated the SS and infected the Wehrmacht more broadly. In the 1990s, the opening of Eastern European archives and the declassification of German documents revealed the full extent of Waffen-SS criminality. Historians gained access to records showing that the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Peiper's division, had been implicated in multiple massacres on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1944. Villages had been burned, prisoners executed, civilians murdered in reprisal operations. The massacres at Malmedy and Honsfeld were not isolated incidents caused by the pressure of the Ardennes offensive, but were consistent with patterns of behaviour the division had displayed for years. Peiper himself had commanded units during some of these Eastern Front operations. Whether he personally ordered atrocities or simply commanded units that committed them remained debatable, but his command responsibility was clear. The archival evidence demolished the narrative that Peiper was a clean soldier whose unit happened to commit crimes in Belgium. Instead, it revealed a commander whose unit had a documented history of criminality that Peiper either ordered, tolerated, or failed to prevent. The debate over Peiper's legacy crystallized around a fundamental question: can we separate military competence from moral culpability? Professional military analysts acknowledge that Peiper was a skilled tactical commander. His use of combined arms, his aggressive exploitation of breakthrough opportunities, his personal courage under fire, all met professional standards of military excellence. War colleges study the Ardennes offensive, including Peiper's role, as an example of armoured operations under difficult conditions. But does acknowledging tactical skill somehow diminish the moral horror of the massacres? Or can we simultaneously recognise that someone was good at their profession while also recognising that their profession included systematic criminality? Historians increasingly argue that the two can and must be held in tension. Peiper was both a capable commander and a war criminal, and neither fact erases the other. In 2004, the town of Gleize opened the December 1944 Historical Centre, a museum dedicated to the Battle of the Bulge. The museum displays artefacts from the battle, including a preserved Sherman tank and King Tiger No. 213, the massive German tank that was abandoned during the breakout and later became a symbol of German defeat. The museum's exhibits are carefully balanced, presenting both German and American perspectives, honouring the soldiers who fought while not glorifying war or sanitising atrocities. The Malmedy massacre is documented with survivor testimony and photographs. Peiper is presented as a complex figure, skilled commander and war criminal. The museum represents modern historical memory, attempting to grapple with complexity rather than reducing the past to simple narratives of heroism or villainy. For Belgian communities that endured the battle, the museum provides a way to remember their suffering while acknowledging the human dimensions of all participants. The U.S. Army War College conducted a study in 2019 examining leadership lessons from the Battle of the Bulge. The study acknowledged German tactical competence, while noting that tactical excellence without strategic coherence, adequate logistics, and moral restraint is ultimately self-defeating. The section on Kampfgruppe Peiper noted that the massacres at Malmedy and elsewhere had backfired strategically by stiffening American resistance and eliminating the possibility of American units surrendering when surrounded. The study observed that atrocities rarely serve military purposes and almost always create negative strategic consequences. American soldiers who might have surrendered in hopeless situations instead fought to the last round after learning about Malmedy. The massacre thus cost German forces more casualties than it saved time. The moral failure was also a tactical failure, demonstrating that war crimes are bad policy, even setting aside ethical considerations. The online historical debates about Peiper and Kampfgruppe Peiper continue to this day, reflecting broader arguments about World War II memory. Some online communities lionize Peiper as a misunderstood hero, emphasizing his tactical achievements while dismissing or minimizing the atrocities. These communities often overlap with groups that rehabilitate other Nazi figures, suggesting ideological motivations beyond historical interest. Other online communities focus exclusively on the war crimes, arguing that any acknowledgement of Peiper's military competence somehow excuses or relativizes the massacres. Mainstream historians attempt to navigate between these extremes, insisting that complexity is possible. One can acknowledge that Peiper was skilled at his profession, while also acknowledging that his profession included systematic murder and that he bears command responsibility for crimes committed by his subordinates. This nuanced position satisfies neither those who want to rehabilitate Peiper nor those who want to reduce him to pure villainy, but it is the position most consistent with historical evidence. The question of whether we can honor the tactical achievements of soldiers who served evil causes remains fundamentally unresolved. Museums display the King Tiger from La Gleize as a technical marvel, which it was, but that tank was operated by a unit that murdered prisoners. Does displaying the tank somehow honor the criminals who operated it? Or can we appreciate engineering and tactical employment while simultaneously condemning the purposes to which those were put? The answer seems to require holding multiple truths simultaneously. The King Tiger was an impressive piece of military technology. It was operated by war criminals. Acknowledging the first does not excuse the second. Condemning the second does not require ignoring the first. This cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable, but discomfort may be appropriate when confronting historical actors who combined competence with criminality. The legacy of Kampfgruppe Peiper for military ethics is perhaps its most enduring impact. The unit's story is taught at military academies and war colleges as a case study in command responsibility. Officers learn that they are accountable for subordinate actions, that creating operational pressure that leads subordinates to commit crimes does not absolve commanders of responsibility, and that systematic criminality within a unit reflects command climate that the commander created or failed to correct. The Malmedy trial's legal precedents informed contemporary military justice systems. The principle that commanders cannot simply claim ignorance of subordinate crimes is now embedded in military law across democratic militaries. Peiper's legacy in this sense is educational. He serves as an example of how not to command, how tactical success cannot compensate for moral failure, and how command responsibility extends to crimes one did not personally commit but should have prevented. For the survivors of the Malmedy massacre and their families, Peiper's legacy is simpler and more personal. He commanded the unit that murdered their loved ones, and he was never held fully accountable. The commutation of his death sentence and his early release from prison sent a message that war crimes prosecution is subject to political expediency. His comfortable retirement in France while victims' families mourned for decades seemed unjust. His violent death in 1976 provided a form of rough justice that the legal system had failed to deliver, but it came too late and through extra-legal means that set their own troubling precedents. For these families, Peiper's legacy is not an interesting historical question but a source of enduring pain and frustration about justice denied. Their perspective deserves weight in any assessment of how history should remember Kampfgruppe Peiper and its commander. The broader historiographical debate about the Wehrmacht and SS continues to evolve as generational distance from World War II increases. The generation that fought the war is now gone. The generation that remembered the war as children is aging. Contemporary students encounter the war only through documents, photographs, and historical accounts. This generational shift allows for more dispassionate analysis, but also risks losing the moral clarity that proximity to atrocity provided. There is a danger that tactical competence becomes emphasized while criminality fades, that the impressive tank designs and dramatic military operations become the story, while the murdered prisoners become footnotes. Responsible historical memory requires resisting this drift towards sanitization. Kampfgruppe Peiper's story must include both the tactical operations and the massacres, both the impressive equipment and the men murdered in the snow, both the military professionalism and the systematic criminality. Only by holding all these elements in view simultaneously can we understand what happened and what it means. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, the last direct witnesses are gone. What remains are the documents, the photographs, the physical sites where the battle occurred, and the historical narratives that shape how we remember. In La Gleize, King Tiger No. 213 sits outside the museum, its massive gun pointed at nothing, a monument to both impressive engineering and decisive defeat. Belgian school children visit on field trips, touching the thick armor, climbing on the treads, learning about the battle that destroyed their grandparents' villages. They learn that this tank was abandoned by its crew, that it represents both the peak of German armored technology and the failure of the offensive it was supposed to spearhead. They learn about the massacre at Malmedy, about American soldiers murdered after surrendering, about justice delayed and complicated. If they ask whether the men who operated this tank were heroes or criminals, the honest answer is both. They were skilled soldiers who committed atrocities, tactical professionals who murdered prisoners, brave men who fought for evil purposes. History is uncomfortable when it refuses to simplify, but simplification dishonors both the victims of crimes and the complexity of human behavior. The final lesson of Kampfgruppe Peiper's story may be about the limits of military virtue. Courage, tactical skill, physical bravery, leadership ability, all the martial virtues that armies cultivate and societies honor, can be placed in service of atrocity. The SS exemplified this paradox. Elite soldiers, extensively trained, ideologically committed, capable of remarkable military feats, and simultaneously capable of systematic murder. The combination is not rare in history. Military effectiveness and moral monstrosity often coexist. Acknowledging this coexistence does not require abandoning moral judgment. We can recognize that Peiper and his men were skilled soldiers, while also insisting that skill does not excuse war crimes, and that command responsibility holds leaders accountable regardless of tactical achievements. The uncomfortable truth is that the human capacity for both excellence and evil is not distributed among different people, but often exists within the same individuals. Joachim Peiper was not a cartoon villain, nor was he a misunderstood hero. He was a talented commander who served an evil cause, who created conditions that led to atrocities, and who bears historical responsibility for crimes committed under his command. His legacy, and the legacy of Kampfgruppe Peiper, is a reminder that military history must be more than the study of tactics and operations. It must also be the study of moral choices, command responsibility, and the human cost of war. Only by confronting the full complexity of figures like Peiper can we learn the lessons that history offers about war, morality, and the limits of military professionalism when placed in service of fundamentally criminal purposes.